It is difficult to overstate how much Tolkien influenced our world. He's often accredited with creating fantasy as a genre, but beyond that, his influence can be seen in all of literature, in language, and even in the way many people perceive war and peace, nature and industry, sin and redemption, good and evil. Saying that The Lord of the Rings is a cornerstone of our modern mythology and will remain influential, meanwhile, is an understatement. In this video, we will give the retelling of the War of the Ring that is central in Tolkien's works. These long videos are extremely difficult to make, and the algorithm is not exactly in love with us, so please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. The War of the Ring finds its origin in the Second Age, as following the destruction of Morgoth in the War of Wrath, his lieutenant Sauron assumed the mantle of Dark Lord. Being a Maiar, and thus lacking the sheer might of a true member of the Valar, who had godlike power, Sauron used his guile and innate ability for treachery to fulfill his ambition. He changed his image, disguising himself as the benevolent servant of the Valar, Annatar. In the year 1500 of the Second Age, he used his silver tongue to trick the Forgemaster Celebrimbor and the other prominent members of the Noldor elven community living in Middle-earth into forging the rings of power infused with magic. There were 20 such rings, 3 bestowed upon the elves, 7 to the dwarves, and 9 to the kings of men, who would later become the Nazgûl. However, Sauron forged his own ring in secret, one ring which would allow him to exert control upon all others. Upon learning of his treachery, the elven ring-bearers removed their rings of power, as when they wore such items, Sauron knew of their location and was able to wage war upon them. The conflict called the War of the Elves began in 1693, and Sauron's power proved to be too much for the elves. Their kingdoms were devastated, and Sauron became the effective ruler of all of Middle-earth. It was at this time that Barad-dûr and the Black Gate in the region of Mordor were raised. However, he failed to dominate the Dwarven ring-bearers due to their stubborn nature. The elven king Gil-galad was pushed all the way to the River Lune, prompting him to request the aid of the men of Númenor in the year 1695. This led to the Númenorian invasion of Middle-earth, bringing an army of a scale that has never been fielded by the race of man in the past. The allied forces won a great victory in 1701 at the Battle of the Gwathlar. The forces of Sauron were driven from the field, and he barely escaped to Mordor. While he was gathering his strength, the elves started rebuilding. Gil-galad's lieutenant Elrond was appointed the regent of the easternmost stronghold of the Noldor elves, Rivendell. Meanwhile, the Númenorians reveled in their victory, and over the next centuries colonized the coast of Middle-earth, oppressing the members of their race living on the continent in the process. At the same time, the sources mention their envy of the elven immortality, and the fact that the men were not allowed to sail to the undying lands of Valinor to live an eternal life. This divided the Númenorian society into 2 factions: the faithful, who remained true to their friendship with the elves and loyalty to the Valar, and the king's men, who were led by the ambitions of their monarchs, slowly drifting towards evil. Sauron used the animosity between the men and the elves to rally dark forces, and assumed the title of Lord of the Earth and King of Men. His armies attacked the Númenorian cities on the continent in the year 3260, drawing the ire of the proud Númenorian king Ar-Pharazôn. The latter struck back in 3261. Númenorian forces were so overwhelmingly powerful that Sauron's minions seemingly abandoned their lord. The Númenorians walked to Barad-dûr unopposed and brought Sauron as a prisoner in chains to the island of Númenor. However, the latter soon worked his way into the court of the king of Númenor. The foul machinations of Sauron would lead to the destruction of Númenor, as he acted as an advisor, poisoning the minds of the people and driving them to their own demise, instigating an invasion of the Undying Lands in 3319. Ar-Pharazôn and his mighty host landed on Aman, but were buried by mounds of dirt by the Eru Ilúvatar, who in his wrath sunk their island, killing the majority of the Númenórean people. 9 ships of the Númenórean faithful were able to flee to Middle-earth, and they were led by Elendil and his 2 sons Isildur and Anarion. When their forces were separated, the majority of the contingent landed in the south, and would form the Kingdom of Gondor, with the remaining ships landing in the north of the continent to create the Kingdom of Arnor. The survivors merged with the remaining Númenóreans who had colonized the regions in question during the apex of Númenórean power. Sauron also survived the downfall of Númenor, although his strength was much reduced. He was able to flee to Mordor and retain the One Ring. The 2 Númenórean nations in exile were linked with the King of Arnor, holding the title of High King and maintaining ascendancy over their Gondorian counterparts. 2 fortresses were built in the region of Gondor to act as a bulwark against Mordor, Minas Ithil and Minas Anor. In the meantime, Sauron had finally regained enough of his strength in order to take physical form. Becoming aware of the newly established exile kingdoms, he quickly took action to destroy them. In 3429, his armies attacked Gondor rapidly, besieging Minas Ithil and the capital of Gondor, Osgiliath. Minas Ithil was lost soon after, as the city's defenders were overwhelmed by the orcish numbers who took the city with relative ease. While Anarion held the line in Osgiliath with the force that he had hastily assembled, Isildur rushed north to inform his father Elendil of the attack. Anarion was successful in repelling the invasion force and sending them fleeing into the woods of Ithilien. Taking counsel with the elven leaders, the last alliance of men and elves was formed, with Elendil and Gil-galad providing leadership for each of their races respectively. 2 years were spent raising sufficient forces in order to match the hordes of orcs that the Dark Lord could bring to bear. Their forces amassed at the watchtower of Amon-Sul at Weathertop, before moving to Rivendell and joining with the forces of Elrond there. From here, the Great Alliance crossed the Misty Mountains, and were joined by contingents of elves from Mirkwood and Lorien, as well as an army of dwarves of Khazad-dûm, and the army of Gondor led by Anarion, fresh from pushing back the assault on Osgiliath. With this, the war was joined, and the alliance seemed poised to end the influence of the Dark Lord upon Middle-earth for good and all. The first pitched battle took place at the plains of Dagorlad, outside of Mordor, in the year 3434, with supreme command of the alliance forces being granted to Gil-galad. However, this grant of command triggered the arrogance of the elves, namely that of the kings of Mirkwood and Lorien, Oropher and Amdir respectively. As both forces deployed their formations, one of the main advantages the last alliance possessed was their cohesion and discipline, for which the elven swordsmen in particular were famed far and wide. Yet the 2 aforementioned kings, angered by Gil-galad's command, broke formation and charged wildly at the immense force of orcs and foul beasts, attempting to garner fame and fortune by their exploits. Despite making early gains and driving the orcs back by the sheer force of their strength at arms, the numbers and sheer brutality of their foe soon led to casualties among the elves. Before long, the elves who had foolishly charged into the forces of the Dark Lord were pushed back, leaving the fate of the battle on a knife's edge. His plan disrupted by the folly of his comrades, Gil-galad acted decisively, supporting the errant elven contingent with the weight of the entirety of what the free peoples of Middle-earth could muster. The leadership of Gil-galad ultimately saved the day, and the war effort as a whole, as the forces of Sauron were decisively beaten, leaving the Dark Lord on the back foot for the remainder of the war. Yet this battle was as costly as they come. with Amdir, Orifer, and a vast contingent of Mirkwood and Lorien forces lost due to the folly of the two kings. This left the area permanently scarred by the mass of human, elven, dwarven, and orcish casualties, which now blighted the landscape, forever transforming the region into the Dead Marshes, an area avoided by all but the most desperate. Thranduil and Amroth would take the titles of Kings of Lorien and Mirkwood from their slain fathers, respectively. Taking little time to regroup, Gil-galad sensed the golden opportunity which now beckoned, and following the counsel of the other leaders of the alliance, Elendil and Elrond chief among them, a decision was taken. The Black Gates were besieged, and soon breached due to the sheer might of the force which now moved even further into Mordor, defeating each force which Sauron sent to face them. While ultimate success was not yet guaranteed, the forces of man, elf and dwarf were buoyed by each victory, and with their morale soaring, their greatest challenge now loomed before them. Despite severe losses, they maintained an advantage, which prevented this war of attrition in a plateau to the north of Mordor called Udun from halting their progress. Initially, attempts were made to storm Barad-dûr, but this failed almost immediately due to the immense fortifications which Sauron had erected in order to prepare for just such a situation. The fortress was created by the dark magic of Sauron, which held it together, and was composed of battlement after battlement and had taken close to 600 years to construct, and was without any shadow of a doubt the greatest fortress in Middle-earth. The sight of it drove fear into the besiegers, and cast doubt upon their ability to seize the victory they so desperately required to end the threat posed to all those who resided within the free realms of Middle-earth. This fortress was also bound to the One Ring, and as long as the ring persisted, it would remain impossible to fully destroy it, adding to the mounting logistical complications which such a siege could pose to Gil-galad and Elendil. The siege would go on for 7 years, with massive casualties dealt to the forces of the last alliance. Countless sorties of orcs were sent out to drive back the besiegers, which when combined with the volleys of arrows, boulders, and missiles of the flaming variety that constantly harassed the attackers, threatened to decimate the alliance forces. In the 6th year of the siege, tragedy struck the line of Elendil as Anarion was hit by a missile fired from the walls of Barad-dûr in the head and was killed instantly. His death caused many woes among the Númenóreans, who mourned his valor and competent leadership. This, however, increased the determination of the race of men to secure their future in those fiery plains. A year later, Sauron and his forces sallied forth in an attempt to bring an end to the conflict and finish the siege and the last alliance with it. Rows of elven swordsmen who made up the flower of the host held the centre, alongside the most experienced and battle-hardened of the Númenóreans, with dwarven contingents supporting the remaining warriors of Gondor and Arnor on the flanks. Elrond and Gil-galad held command of the centre, with Elendil and Isildur commanding their own respective forces. The blood of Númenor still flowed freely through the forces of man at this stage in the exile, and as such, these warriors remained exceptionally competent and unyielding in the face of the overwhelming orcish onslaught. Despite their prowess in battle, however, the forces of the last alliance remained outnumbered. The forces of Mordor surged forward in a tide bereft of any true tactics. They attempted to use the weight of their numerical advantage to overwhelm the organized and tactically astute battle lines assembled before them. While their weapons and armor were deficient in comparison to those of their opponents, their ferocity and crazed devotion to their Dark Lord were not to be scoffed at. The battle was joined when the orcish host met the elven swordsmen in the centre, their forces having been thinned out by the overwhelmingly accurate volleys of arrows unleashed by the elven archers. The lines held as the warriors of the last alliance refused to grant their opponents an inch, as the famed discipline of Noldor was able to keep the Orcish host at bay. Despite the increasing pressure which was placed upon their lines, this stalemate was maintained, with massive casualties inflicted on both sides. As the battle progressed, the last alliance began to gain the advantage, standing as a cliff before the oncoming tide. The morale of the Orcish rabble began to falter, and it seemed that victory now was within the grasp of Gil-galad and Elendil. It was at this point that Sauron, in his physical form of a towering warrior, clad in plate armor from head to toe, and wielding a mace alongside the One Ring, entered the fray. Making for the center of the alliance formation, he soon made light work of the valiant warriors who had held his servants at bay for so long. Seeing that their lines might now break, Gil-galad and Elendil dueled Sauron, who had not reached his full strength yet, on the broken plains of Mordor, displaying the great valor inherent within their people, proving to be a match for the Dark Lord. As the battle raged around them, the two great leaders of the last alliance mortally wounded Sauron, but paid a heavy price for their courage. Gil-galad was cast down with the heat of Sauron's armored hand, and Elendil was likewise struck down by the Maiar, who was wounded in the process. The sheer weight of the blow drove Sauron from his physical form, causing him to take on his ethereal aspect, and his disappearance sent his entire army into a rout. In the aftermath, Isildur, who came upon the corpses of the great leaders of the Alliance, was heartbroken by the loss of his father. He took up the shattered remnant of Narsil and strode towards the ailing Maiar. Bending down, Isildur cut off the armoured finger which held the One Ring, and claimed it as his own weregild. Sauron's spirit fled his physical form. Narsil, however, would live long in the memory of the Dark Lord, and he would forever bear an unequivocal hatred for the line of kings of the Númenórean exiles. With the defeat of Sauron and his forces at the siege of Barad-dûr came the end of the Second Age and the beginning of the Third, which would come to be dominated by the men due to the waning power of the elves following the death of so many of them, and the decision taken by some to sail to the Undying Lands. At this stage, however, the situation was far from ideal for the descendants of Númenor, even with the apparent destruction of the great enemy. Even before the last alliance entered Mordor, Sauron sent a contingent of orcs to hold the passes in the Misty Mountains from the oncoming host of Elendil and Gil-galad. Seeing the strength of the free peoples of Middle-earth before them, the orcs fled into the mountains, and were not pursued due to the necessity of defeating the Dark Lord, however. Following the successful siege of Barad-dûr, Isildur, who took the Ring of Sauron as a weregild for the death of his father and brother, made his way to Gondor. Isildur spent the first 2 years of the new Third Age consolidating his rule and reorganizing the realm. He also replanted the sapling of the White Tree in Minas Ithil in memory of his fallen brother. The Númenóreans, who remained true to Valar, began to also be known as Dunedain and the Men of the West in that period. The greater part of his army was sent to Arnor, which needed it more at the moment, and the king himself set out for Rivendell in order to seek the counsel of Elrond. Moving from Osgiliath, Isildur and his retinue passed through the Vale of Anduin, making their way towards the Cirith Fôn Enandrath, which was a high pass in the Misty Mountains, inevitably bringing them to Rivendell. The host made its way north to Lorien, taking a path leading towards Thranduil's domain of Greenwood. The Anduin, however, had flooded, forcing the group to take an alternative route along the slopes of the eastern bank of the Great River. To the left of the company were an imposing set of cliffs overlooking the Anduin, and to their right were hills and forested areas. The Dunedain had been singing marching songs. However, this ceased immediately as one of their scouts had heard an oncoming horde of orcs. Acting quickly, Isildur formed his men into a thangale, which meant shield fence or wall in Númenórean. This formation was 2 men deep and flexible on the flanks, allowing for quick readjustments, and would favour the Númenóreans, who estimated that they were outnumbered almost 10 to 1. Isildur begrudged the terrain for forcing him to take such a defensive stance, as if the orcs had attacked them earlier in the march, they could have formed a Dirnaith, which was a wedge-shaped formation that would have allowed the superior martial prowess of his retinue to shatter the orcish lines, sending them into a quick rout. The battle began with a volley of orcish arrows, quickly followed up by an assault at the very centre of the shield wall. The disciplined Númenóreans stood strong and used their immense height, with which they towered over even the largest orc, to push back this onslaught. Isildur was no fool, however, and seeing the overwhelming size of the orcish horde, sent his squire with the shards of his father's sword, Narsil, to Rivendell, in order to entrust them with Lord Elrond before continuing the fight himself. The battle restarted following this brief pause, and piles of orc corpses had begun to mount around the Númenórean lines, who, utilizing their superior longbows, drove the enemy from the pathway. Believing that the orcs, with their craven nature, had been sufficiently demoralized as to flee the field, Isildur gave orders to move to lower, more level ground. The orcs, however, had greater numbers than the estimation Isildur had given them, and returned in force as the shield wall had begun to move. During this secondary assault, the orcs attacked in a full crescent formation in order to place immense pressure upon the entirety of the Dunedain defensive formation. With their massive numerical advantage, the orcish pressure began to pay off, and men began to die, their formation beginning to collapse. Isildur's sons, Cirion and Aratan, were slain in this assault, with the third son to accompany him on the journey, Elendor, urging his father to wear the ring and flee across the Anduin to make it to Rivendell using another road. Isildur said, "I cannot use it. I dread the pain of touching it, and I have not yet found the strength to bend it to my will. It needs one greater than I know myself to be. My pride has fallen. It should go to the keepers of the three." But he was convinced by his son. Isildur put on the Ring of Sauron, which granted invisibility to the wearer, and fled down the valley as his retinue paid with their lives to give their king a fighting chance at escape, dying almost to a man. That included Elendor, who fought a rearguard action to buy his father more time. Abandoning his arms and armour, bar a short sword, Isildur plunged into the Anduin, yet in its flooded state, the strength of the river began to overwhelm the High King, and he was pulled further and further towards the marshes of the Gladden Fields. He became tangled in the reeds and rushes, and the One Ring was pulled from Isildur's finger, who initially felt unmitigated loss at this, but soon after a feeling of immense burden being taken from him. This feeling of absolution was not to last, however, as emerging from the river, a group of orcish archers spotted this imposing mountain of a man and feathered him with arrows rather than meeting the unarmoured warrior in hand-to-hand combat. Isildur's body fell back into the river, never to be recovered. His arms and armour were found in the aftermath of the battle, but the ring itself would not be discovered again until Hobbit Daegul happened upon it in TA 2463. In the meantime, a force of woodmen who were friends of the Beornings and dwelt within the western part of Greenwood had come to relieve the Dunedain rearguard. They arrived too late, however, and would only save 3 of the Dunedain. The disaster at the Gladden Fields had led to the death of Isildur and his 3 sons. Isildur's youngest son, Valindir, was named King of Arnor. However, the most important decision taken during his reign was to refuse the kingship of Gondor, which caused a split between the 2 kingdoms. The 2 kingdoms, however, would continue to prosper under the kings of Númenórean blood. However, following the death of King Eärendor in TA 861, Arnor was torn asunder by infighting and civil war. The kingdoms of Arthedain, Cardolan and Rhudaur emerged from this conflict, with the king of Arthedain claiming unrecognized high kingship over the latter. In the years that followed, the kings of the respective northern kingdoms wasted their strength in foolish and unnecessary conflicts which left each nation weakened. In the meantime, enemies began to gather on the outskirts of these nations, eager to take advantage, presenting the greatest threat to the land once known as Arnor. Meanwhile, the kingdom of Gondor began to prosper, becoming a wholly separate political entity. Gondor had to deal with an invasion of the Easterlings, who were men corrupted by Sauron and Morgoth. This initial invasion sparked a 60-year conflict, which was brought to a conclusion by Turambar, the 9th king of Gondor, who successfully defeated the Easterlings and annexed a large area from Rhovanion to Mordor. Gondor entered a golden age following this victory, helmed by the 4 ship kings who ruled wisely, beginning with the reign of Tir-Anen-Falistur in TA 830 and ending with the death of Hiarmendikil I in TA 1149. The latter expanded Gondor to its greatest extent, ruling a nation which stretched from the fringes of Mirkwood in the north to Umbar in the south. The military might of Gondor ensured this superiority, with many visitors at the time remarking, "In Gondor, precious stones are but pebbles for the children to play with." Yet this golden age was about to end, as the defeat of Sauron was not as everlasting as the Great Alliance had hoped. During the reign of King Malvagil of Arthedain, Sauron's lieutenant, the Witch King of Angmar, head of the Nazgul, and bearer of a Ring of Power, had emerged at the head of a large host of orcs and other creatures. He drove the dwarves from their holds and established a nation of Angmar. Malvagil's successor, Osgiliath, managed to unite Arthedain and Cardolan, but was unable to sway Rhudaur, which had already fallen to the taint of the Witch King. Hostilities commenced when the men of Rhudaur were forced to march on their kinsmen in Arthedain in TA 1356. In the Battle of Amon Sul, which decided the conflict, many were slaughtered on both sides, chief among them the would-be uniter of the north, Osgiliath. The following years were to prove utterly devastating for the northern realms. In TA 1409, Rhudaur was annexed by Angmar, and with this added strength, the Witch King attacked Cardolan. The country was devastated, with most of its settlements being destroyed. Amon Sul was razed, and the survivors fled westward. Arthedain was invaded next, and its capital Fornost was besieged, but the elves of the Grey Havens, Lorien and Rivendell, relieved it. United armies of the elves, led by Elrond, defeated Angmar, but not completely, and the conflict left Arthedain as the last human kingdom in the north, locked in a bitter struggle with Angmar for 600 years. The matters to the south were also far from idyllic. The Easterlings continued to be a threat, but Gondor's military superiority allowed Hiarmendikil I to utterly rout the Easterling host in TA 1248, with the aid of the men of Rhovanion, who would later become the Rohirrim. Internal discord also played its part. The nobles despised King Valakar for marrying a princess of Rhovanion, and when he died in TA 1432, his son, King Eldakar, was overthrown by Castamir, the captain of the ships. He proved an incapable ruler who caused the decay of much of the country. Eldakar returned in 1447, and with the help of the Rhovanion horsemen, regained his throne. However, Osgiliath was sacked, and its palantir, alongside its splendour, was forever lost. In the meantime, the sons of Castamir, following the death of their father, fled to Umbar, establishing their own kingdom, which would trouble Gondor for centuries. These problems didn't allow Gondor to help Arnor when its aid may have proved pivotal in stemming the tide. Both nations managed to recover some of their former power, with King Telemnar even planning a conquest of Umbar. However, the Great Plague struck in 1636. In the north, Cardolan was finally left bereft of any human population, and Barrow Wights from Angmar, which were spirits of a malicious nature, were sent by the enemy to take over the former settlements. Gondor's cities were decimated, and many tasks with watching over Mordor were abandoned. The White Tree died in Osgiliath, and a sapling was brought to Minas Arnor, which became the capital in 1640. It is said that had an enemy attacked at this point, all of Gondor would have fallen. Yet said foes were in as bad of a shape as Gondor following the plague. Arthedain, with its sparser population, was not as badly affected by the plague. However, its population continued to decline during this period, with some of its best farmland being granted to the hobbits in TA 1601, forming what would become the Shire. Both nations were to survive this dire situation, however, with King Aravel of Arthedain alongside his elven allies defeating the Witch King in Cardolan in TA 1851, earning his kingdom what was to be its final reprieve. Aravel's prowess as a diplomat allowed for increased ties with Gondor, and had circumstances not played their part, could have brought about the salvation of his realm. However, the forces of the Dark Lord had other contingencies in place, it seemed, and both nations were to be forever changed by the conflict to come. In TA 1851, a confederation of Easterling tribes called Wainriders began to raid Gondor and Rivenian, enslaving many of the latter and destroying much of what was their home. After 5 years of these raids, the king, Narmakil II, led a force alongside Mahari of Rivenian to meet the Wainriders in the field. The Battle of the Plains was a complete disaster for Gondor, as King Narmakil was slain and Mahari, leading a desperate rearguard in order to save the remnants of the host, was also killed, effectively ending Rivenian as a nation. The remnants of Mahari's people fled into Gondor, where they would become known as the Eotheod under his son Mawini. However, the majority of the Rivenian were enslaved by the Wainriders, who had won a decisive yet Pyrrhic victory, with their casualties being so severe so as to check their advance further into Gondor. The Wainriders were to rule in Rivenian for 45 years, and weakened Gondor was unable to turn its eyes to the north, where Angmar had gathered its forces for one final push into Arthedain. During this period, the Eotheod and Gondor continued to grow in friendship through their opposition against the Wainriders. The Eotheod in particular learned of the Wainriders' plans to attack Gondor in TA 1899 through the enslaved populace which still owed them loyalty. This led to a preemptive strike by King Kelamatar from northern Ithilien, disrupting Wainrider plans to assault the Eotheod in Calenarden. With this, Mawini gathered his horsemen and marched to Gondor's aid in what would become known as the Second Battle of Dagorlad, where the massed armies defeated the Wainriders. The king chose not to pursue them, however, allowing for a slave revolt in Rivenian to further weaken them instead. However, they were not fully defeated, as the revolt was not fully successful. The decision to not pursue the Wainriders would come back to haunt Gondor, as they made alliances with the men of Khand and Harad. The Eotheod again warned Gondor of this dual threat in both the north and south. King Ondahur, alongside King Arvedui of Arthedain, realized that the attacks of Angmar and the Wainriders must have been coordinated by an overwhelmingly menacing force, and this led to the ties between nations being renewed in TA 1940 as Arvedui married Ondahur's daughter Firiel. King Ondahur marched north, while his most trusted general Eänil marched south. Ondahur hoped to fight in Dagorlad again, but was surprised outside the Black Gate by a combined force of Wainriders and Rhûn, who destroyed his army, killing him and 2 of his sons. The Wainriders believed Gondor had been completely defeated and took their time sacking lands along Ithilien. Yet this was not the case, as Eänil's smaller force had won to the south. Accumulating the survivors of the battle at the Black Gate, Eänil fell upon the Wainrider camp, utterly routing them. Those who survived drowned in the dead marshes, effectively ending the war. Eänil was named King of Gondor, despite Arvedui's claim to the kingship, which would have united both nations under a common banner, giving them the strength to resist this northern advance by the Witch King, as the Council of Gondor preferred the former's claim. Rivenian was freed, with its people mostly joining the Eotheod. However, the war weakened Gondor at an absolutely critical moment, resulting in the loss of territory. Throughout the entirety of this period, Angmar continued to assault Arnor, who resisted fiercely yet hopelessly, making their foes pay for every inch. In TA 1974, the kingdom was finally overrun, with the Witch King sweeping across the country, driving all before him, and taking the capital of Fornost, causing King Arvedui and his remaining followers to flee. Arvedui drowned in the ice bay of Farichel during the rout. he was the last king of Arthedain. The Witch King now seemed poised to form his empire in the north. King of Gondor, Eärnil, sent a force commanded by his son, Eärnur, with as many soldiers as he could spare, to relieve Avedui when the attack just started. This army arrived a year too late, as the kingdom of Arthedain had already been destroyed. With the Prince of Gondor came men of Rhovanion, elves from Lindon, and other such northern elven kingdoms, the survivors of Arthedain, among them Prince Aranath, and according to Shire historians, a company of their finest archers. Seeing that the burned-out shell of Fornost would provide countless opportunities for ambush, Eärnur moved his forces to a plain west of the city, near Lake Evendim, to meet the Witch King in open territory. The armies of Angmar rushed to meet them, and seeing this, the Prince of Gondor sent his cavalry north into the hills of Evendim to ambush the overconfident foes. With this, the battle began, as the might of Angmar crashed into the Gondorian centre. This assault could have proved catastrophic if it was not for the battle-hardened lines of infantry who had repulsed the Wain Riders in the not-so-distant past. The fighting was brutal, with casualties beginning to mount on both sides. It is at this point the cavalry, sensing the pivotal moment in the battle, charged down from the hills, crashing into the rear of Angmar's line. The battle shifted immediately, with the surrounded warriors of Angmar falling in swathes. Realizing he was all but defeated, the Witch King attempted to retreat to the east. Yet he would earn no reprieve there, as the elven hero Glorfindel led a second host from Rivendell up from the south. So, caught between a rock and a hard place, the army of the Witch King was utterly destroyed. Eärnur then challenged the Witch King to single combat as the army of Angmar fell apart around him. His stalwart heart, however, was not matched by that of his horse, as it panicked under the Witch King's gaze and fled. The Witch King taunted the young prince before fleeing the field himself. It is at this point that Glorfindel uttered the famous words to his young friend and ally that, "Not by the hand of mortal man would the Witch King be slain." Sauron was immensely pleased by this result, as the destruction of Arnor was of far greater import than the loss of Angmar, and as distracted Gondor lost the pivotal fortress of Minas Ithil to the Ringwraiths as their forces were tied down in the north. It would later be renamed Minas Morgul, or the Tower of Black Sorcery, while Minas Anor was renamed Minas Tirith, or the Tower of the Guard in the common tongue. In the north, Aranath, bearing witness to how few of his people had survived, declined to refound Arthedain, instead becoming the first chieftain of the Dunedain, maintaining this rule for 131 years in the wilds of Eriador in order to protect his people from Angmar's evil. Following the death of his father, Eärnur became king in TA 2043. He was immensely capable, but his vanity soon got the better of him. The Witch King played upon this fatal flaw, challenging the childless king to single combat. Remembering the shame he had felt at Fornost, the king was going to accept it if it were not for the wise counsel of his steward, Mardil Veronwe. The second challenge came in TA 2050, accusing the king of cowardice, and this time Mardil was unable to sway the king from such a foolish action. Leaving his crown on the tomb of his father, Eärnur marched out with a small escort of knights to the plains of Minas Morgul, never to be heard from again. With this ended the line of Anarion, and Gondor was left kingless in the hands of the stewards, who ruled with varying degrees of competency. They were to rule until the king returned, as Eärnur had never been confirmed as deceased, nor had he named an heir, and the stewards refused to claim the crown, fearing another civil war. While Gondor persisted during this period, it came extremely close to destruction when a group of Easterlings called Belchoth attacked, influenced by Sauron. Seeing that Gondor could not prevail alone, Steward Cirion sent word to the Eotheod and their ruler Eol the Young. However, hopes that the messengers might get through were slim. Regardless, the army of Gondor prepared to meet the Belchoth on the field of Celebrant, even without any true hope of victory. This battle took place in Calenardon, as Cirion, knowing the defences of the area, knew that he had to fight or allow the Balchoth to put the population of the region to the sword. 6 riders had been sent to Yol. 5 of them were killed on the way north, with the 6th, Borendir, arriving just in time. Eorl, realizing that if Gondor fell, his people could soon return to the pitiful existence they were forced to endure under the Wain Riders, marched his 7,000 horsemen and hundreds of mounted archers along the almost 500-mile road that led to Calenardon. Unfortunately for Cirion, his hopes that the River Anduin would slow down the enemy didn't come true. Before he could arrive, the Balchoth built hundreds of boats and started crossing the river. The defenders of the fortifications guarding the western bank did their best to slow down the foe, but were killed and the fortifications were taken. The steward attempted to relieve the battered defenders, but his forces were easily repelled. Cirion started retreating north, but here he was assaulted by a group of orcs and his forces were pushed towards the Anduin. The situation looked extremely bleak as the Balchoth and orcs descended upon the now hopeless Gondorians. A defense was mounted, but they were continuously pushed closer to the river. It was at this point that Eorl's host entered the fray. His army crossed the Undeeps, and he led a massed cavalry charge right into the rear of the enemy force. The prospect of victory urged the Gondorians on, who, with renewed vigour, provided the anvil upon which the Eotheod could destroy the enemy host. Those who fled from the field were pursued by the Eotheod, who slaughtered as many as they could, forever ending the threat posed by the Balchoth. Following on from the battle, the bonds between Eotheod and Gondor were formalized, as they were granted the almost deserted province of Calenardon, which was soon to become Rohan, and its people, the Rohirrim, or Eorlingus in their own tongue. Eorl swore an eternal oath of friendship to Gondor, that if Gondor called for aid, the men of Rohan would answer. A relationship which would prove to be the determining factor in the fate of both nations. Meanwhile, in the northern part of Middle-earth, the Dwarven peoples began to rise in prominence following the culmination of the War in the North and the destruction of the Kingdom of Arnor at the hands of the Witch King. This brave and hardy folk provided a counterbalance to what could have potentially formed an overwhelming force of orcs and goblins in the northern realms. Chief among Dwarven realms in wealth and significance was the Kingdom of Erebor, situated in the Lonely Mountain overlooking the human settlement of Dale. While Durin's folk had discovered significant mineral deposits and begun the early process of establishing a settlement here as far back as the Second Age, the importance of this realm was only truly felt following the fall of Khazad-dûm, more commonly known as Moria. The dwarves in this kingdom had delved too deep and too greedily, and had awakened a remnant of the First Age, a Balrog of Morgoth, who drove the dwarves from their homes in the Misty Mountains. So, in the year TA 1999, King Thrain I led his people to the Lonely Mountain, becoming the first king under the mountain. The minerals and precious stones they found here made the people of Erebor immensely wealthy. Chief among their possessions was the Arkenstone, a jewel of incredible beauty which was discovered deep within the mountain, and for the next 211 years would be the emblem of the kingdom. This was until King Thorin I led his people to the Grey Mountains to rejoin their kin. They were soon set upon by the dragons who lived in this region, and the costly conflict forced the dwarves to abandon the Grey Mountains in TA 2590. The dwarves went their own ways, with Gror I and his followers settling in the region of the Iron Hills, and Thorin's great-grandson Thror returning to the Lonely Mountain to assume the title of King under the Mountain. Once more the kingdom prospered, becoming the envy of all who came into contact with it, among them those with dark intentions. Thror continued to rule ably, joined by his son Thrain II and grandson Thorin II, who ensured that the line of succession would be maintained in the coming years. The future seemed to be bright, despite the increasing greed of the dwarves, in particular Thror, who now saw the Arkenstone as taking precedence above all else. Everything was to change in TA 2770. On a warm afternoon, as Thorin was out hunting, a gigantic shadow engulfed them, and they glimpsed the immense shape of a great drake, the last great dragon of Middle-earth, Smaug. Riding towards Erebor, Thorin witnessed what had hours earlier been determined impenetrable defences torn asunder. The city of Dale lay in ruin, having been devastated by waves of flame, and the people of Erebor now found themselves exiled from their homes once more. Great death and destruction ensued as Smaug carved his way, making his home in the great vault of Erebor, which was filled with gold and jewels, along with the Arkenstone. Thror, his son Thrain, and several companions managed to escape through a side door and join up with the thousands of survivors who Thorin had successfully brought to safety following his delayed return from his hunting trip. The majority of the survivors relocated to the Iron Hills, joining their cousins, while the rest, led by Thror, exiled themselves in the hills of Dunland. Thror found himself immensely depressed by his inability to find a true home for his people, so he gave the last surviving Dwarven Ring of Power and a detailed map of the Lonely Mountain, which included the locations of several secret entrances and passes, alongside a key to open such, to his son, and alongside one companion, Na, travelled towards Moria. Arriving at the eastern gate, Thror, despite the urging of his companion, passed through the open entrance to the ancestral home of the Dwarven folk. Thror was killed by the local orcs, while Na was captured. He was allowed to return to his people with a message that dwarves will only find death in Moria, which was now ruled by Azog. The message was returned to Thrain III, who sat in silence for 7 days, before deciding that the murder must be answered, beginning the War of Dwarves and Orcs. Between TA 2790 and 2793, he amassed all the warriors the other holds could spare. Then Thrain led his men to avenge his father. As they marched, the dwarves took every goblin hold from Methredith to Gundabad, slaughtering their denizens. The war's climax came in the year TA 2799, as the Dwarven host emerged upon the same valley that Thror had been slain in years earlier, battle-hardened and prepared to do what was required. This would become known as the Battle of Azanul Bizarre, and the fighting was fierce, with neither side willing to give an inch, the fury of the dwarves matched by the cruel strength which had been gifted to the orcs. Yet the wound of Thror's death, and the deaths of so many others during the preceding war, pushed Durin's folk ever onwards. The battle hung on a knife's edge, with Thorin almost dying in the melee as his shield was shattered, before hefting a large piece of oak and beating back his foes with it, earning the moniker Oaken Shield. It was at this point that the dwarves of the Iron Hills arrived, crashing the right flank of the orcish host, driving them all the way back to the gate of Moria. With casualties mounting on either side, Lord of the Iron Hills, Nain, cried out for the orcish leader who fled into Moria to fight him. Returning from his flight, Azog engaged the Dwarven leader in single combat. Despite his valour, the elderly dwarf could not match the sheer strength of Azog, and was slain as his son Dane II Ironfoot looked on helplessly. Immediately, Dane rushed up the steps, avoiding the blow of the gigantic orc while simultaneously landing a heavy blow to his knee. He then decapitated the slayer of his father with a fell stroke of his axe, ending the war and cementing his legacy amongst Durin's folk. Most of the orcs and half of the dwarves were slain in the battle. The aftermath was brutal for the dwarves, with half their number slain, with many prominent Longbeards dead. Thrain himself lost an eye and was left with a limp. Despite this, he urged his people to continue the conflict and take back Moria, with only the wisdom of the new Lord of the Iron Hills preventing them from this ruinous course of action. Meanwhile, the son of Azog, Bolg, swore vengeance against the dwarves. Thrain then relocated the remainder of his people to the Blue Mountains, where they began to prosper. The ring had made Thrain restless, and in TA 2841 he left Thorin as the leader of his people and began a journey with a number of his comrades, hopeful to reconquer the Lonely Mountain. At this point in time, unbeknownst to the free peoples of Middle-earth, Sauron had returned. Posing as a necromancer, he instructed his followers to kidnap Thrain, who was brought to the stronghold of Dol Guldur in the south of Mirkwood. Here he was tortured for information, his ring of power was taken, and he was left to wander the land a broken soul. The stirrings of the rings, and the appearance of the necromancer, prompted the Valar to send 5 Maiar to Middle-earth, where they took the shape of old wizards. One of them, Gandalf the Grey, was sent on a mission from the White Council, a group of the most powerful beings in Middle-earth entrusted with its protection, to investigate Dol Guldur. He met with the former king and was given the key and map to the Lonely Mountain, which he promised to pass to Thorin. Gandalf also discovered that the necromancer was Sauron, and urged the White Council to attack while he was weak. However, another wizard, Saruman, urged caution. Gandalf then sought out Thorin, who had begun to work as a mercenary in order to aid his people. It was at Bree he would meet the King Under the Mountain in exile. Gandalf promised he would aid Thorin in reclaiming his throne, a cause he spoke of ardently, and with such passion it swayed the wizard. Gandalf began to make his preparations, sending Thorin with a company of 12 dwarves, Fili, Kili, Dwalin, Balin, Oin, Gloin, Dori, Nori, Ori, Beaver, Bofer, and Bomber to meet at Bag End in the Shire. Here they hired an unwilling hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, to operate as their burglar in their plan to infiltrate the Lonely Mountain and retake their treasure. Setting out from the Shire, the group met with a multitude of perils, nearly being eaten by trolls until the intervention of Gandalf, as well as being ambushed by orcs, wargs, and spiders. During this early period, they uncovered the legendary weapons Glamdring and Orcrist, which had been forged during the First Age in Gondolin, with Gandalf taking the former, and despite the typical Dwarven misgiving of elvish weapons, Thorin taking the latter. The company rested in Rivendell, where Elrond helped Gandalf with the translation of the runes on the map which Thror had bestowed upon his descendants. The side passage was 5 feet tall, and capable of allowing 3 dwarves to walk abreast, though unfortunately the keyhole could only be found on Durin's Day, when the setting sun and last moon of autumn would shine their light upon it. Gandalf's group then headed eastwards towards the Misty Mountains, where they unknowingly camped on the front porch of Goblin Town, and were captured by the denizens of Moria. Gandalf, who had evaded capture, orchestrated an escape, killing the Great Goblin and freeing the dwarves, who then fought their way out of the town. Bilbo, however, was knocked unconscious, but due to his size, was ignored by the goblins and managed to crawl to safety, finding a small ring in the process. Continuing down the tunnel, Bilbo met a former river hobbit, Gollum, who now had been in possession of the ring for well over 500 years at this point. This led to a contest of riddles, with Bilbo's life on the line, which he won. Gollum tried to attack Bilbo, but the latter had discovered the power of the ring and turned invisible, allowing him to escape and reunite with his companions. Unfortunately, the company was now being chased by goblins and wargs, and was forced to flee to the top of a number of pine trees. Gandalf began to set pine cones alight and hurl them at his foes, which unfortunately began to set the surrounding landscape alight. Without the intervention of the Eagles of Manwë, the company may not have survived the encounter. The Eagles brought them to their eyrie. They then travelled to the house of Bjorn, a skin changer, who either appeared as a large, hairy, powerful man or a gigantic, ferocious bear. At this point, Gandalf departed to join the White Council in an assault on Dol Guldur. Despite the difficulties, they managed to drive Sauron to his long-prepared keep of Barad-dûr. Meanwhile, Bjorn provided the remainder of the party with ponies to reach Mirkwood, where they encountered giant spiders and fought them. The wood elves of King Thranduil living in the area intervened, capturing the dwarves, citing the previous animosity as precedent. Bilbo escaped using the ring. He infiltrated Thranduil's hall and was able to break the dwarves out of the prison, making use of barrels to traverse a river and reach Lake Town in Dale, now a small settlement of men which Smaug would attack every once in a while. Support for the Dwarven company was overwhelming, allowing them to rest and recuperate there for a number of weeks before pressing on. the company reached the side door depicted in Thror's map in time for Durin's Day, allowing Thorin to open the door. Bilbo, who went forward alone as a scout, discovered that Smaug was awake. The dragon sensed the hobbit, but the power of the ring kept his presence shrouded. During his surveillance, Bilbo noticed a small chink in the armor of Smaug's underbelly. Smaug soon discovered that Bilbo was attempting to steal a goblet, causing him to go into a rage and fly out of the fortress. Bilbo urged the company to enter through the side door and seal it behind them, saving their lives as Smaug set the entire area alight. Bilbo told the company of Smaug's intentions to destroy Lake Town, and this was overheard by a thrush, whose language the Dale men could understand, and the bird flew to inform the final descendant of the former lords of Dale, Bard the Bowman. The latter had organized a company of archers to fight Smaug, who attacked Lake Town. When Bard was down to his last arrow, the thrush landed on his shoulder and whispered of Smaug's weakness. Fortunately for the forces of good, Bard's final arrow was the Black Arrow of Dale, an heirloom of Lord Girion of Dale, forged by King Thror himself prior to the fall of Erebor. Bard launched this relic of a former age and managed to hit the weak spot dead center. The last great dragon of Middle-earth died immediately, falling from the sky and destroying Lake Town in its entirety. Meanwhile, the company had fortified Erebor, and Bilbo had uncovered the Arkenstone. However, seeing the change in Thorin's demeanor, and evidencing the same weakness which had poisoned his forefathers, Bilbo kept the jewel from him. Word reached them of the death of Smaug. However, this joy did not last long. The angered King Thranduil had arrived with a large force, lending his support to Bard and his men in their claims of recompense due to the destruction of the town at the hands of the dragon the dwarves had awakened. Greed and hatred had poisoned Thorin's noble heart, however, and he refused the claims of man and elf alike, preferring to defend behind the walls of Erebor, while simultaneously sending a raven to his relative, Dain, Lord of the Iron Hills, for support. In the meantime, he ordered the company to search for the Arkenstone, while also pulling Bilbo aside to award him with a shirt of mithril, an exceedingly expensive material, as a reward for his bravery throughout the quest. This affection did not last, as Bilbo, hoping to avoid conflict, gave the Arkenstone to Bard and Thranduil before returning to the mountain to inform Thorin of his actions. The latter perceived this as treachery, banishing the hobbit, who rejoined the newly returned Gandalf among the elven host. Meanwhile, Dain organized a company of 500 heavily armored, battle-hardened veterans of the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, and soon arrived, leading to a stalemate between the three armies assembled. On the elvish side were 1,000 highly competent and peerless elven spearmen and swordsmen, supported by some 500 archers, and accompanied by 300 militiamen of Lake Town, led by Thranduil and Bard respectively. A battle almost ensued between both companies, had it not been for the intervention of Gandalf, who informed them that innumerable hordes of goblins, led by Bolg, were now marching directly towards them, incited by previous hatreds alongside the slaying of the Great Goblin. Dain, Thranduil and Bard agreed that the oncoming host of orcs, wargs and bats, which outnumbered them massively, should be their core concern. The generals lined their forces at the spurs of the mountain, with the dwarves and men on the left and the elves on the right. A light rearguard was placed in between these two forces in order to entice the orcs to attack, allowing them to be encircled and destroyed. Bilbo attempted to sit out the battle on the elven-held Ravenhill, where he was accompanied by Gandalf. The fighting ensued as the orcs and wargs crashed forward, with the bats supporting them like a sea of locusts. Initially, the allied plan worked perfectly, as the enemy vanguard rushed to the choke point in the center, taking massive losses. However, the sheer weight of numbers ensured this advantage was not held for long on the part of the allied forces. The second wave was far worse, with orcs scaling the sides of the spurs to attack the free folk from the side and rear, while the main wave engaged them from their initial starting point. The allies were hard pressed and were barely surviving the onslaught, and it seemed that the battle would soon be over. It was at this point a great shout went up from the lonely mountain. Thorin Oakenshield finally realized the folly of his ways and crashed forwards with his fellow companions. Their emergence upon the battlefield inspired the free folk. Their charge was so unexpected, and the weapons and armor uncovered within Erebor so effective, that the company pushed its way through the entirety of the Orcish centre, rallying their faltering allies as they passed. Here, they eventually reached the monumentally sized bodyguards of Bolg, through whom they could not force their way. Battle lines and tactics soon devolved into an unorganized and chaotic melee, with no quarter being given on either side, and it seemed as if a stalemate had ensued, which would ultimately favour the orcs, who outnumbered the valorous of the dwarves, men and elves who stood together on that day. It was at this point Bilbo let out the cry, "The eagles are coming!" Indeed, the Lord of the Great Eagles, Gwaihir, had led hundreds of his kind to aid the free folk in their desperate conflict, just as the tide had begun to turn against them. This shout was taken up by the entirety of the allied force, before Bilbo was unfortunately knocked unconscious by a stray rock to the head. The battle began to swing finally in favour of the free folk, as the eagles decimated the Orcish lines in swooping manoeuvres, relieving much of the pressure placed upon both spurs and Thorin in the centre. However, the engagement, that would later be called the Battle of the Five Armies, was truly won when Bjorn arrived in his form of a bear of gargantuan size and crashed into the goblin kind. Just at this point, Thorin attempted to break through and slay Bolg, but was mortally wounded in the attempt. Bjorn, seeing this, brushed through the Orcish lines in order to carry Thorin's broken body to safety. Seeing the wounded king under the mountain and further enraged by it, Bjorn returned to the fray, filled with wrath and seeking vengeance. He smashed the ranks of Bolg's bodyguards before slaying the mighty orc himself in single combat, destroying the morale of the orcs, who were left as easy pickings for the battered but unbroken free folk to decimate. Panicking and scattering, they were slaughtered en masse, with many more losing their lives in Mirkwood as Thranduil's people showed them no mercy. Soon after the battle, Thorin succumbed to his wounds. Before he did so, however, he reconciled with Bilbo, ultimately stating, "If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But, sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell." The battle had been won, but at a massive cost. The free folk suffered heavy casualties, including Thorin, King Under the Mountain, and his nephews Fili and Kili, among many other men, elves and dwarves. Whereas on the part of the orcs, the casualties were catastrophic, with very few of them surviving, shattering the power of the orcs in the north, and denying Sauron a further power base for the great war which was to come. The kingdom under the mountain was reformed, with the titles of King Under the Mountain and King of Durin's folk passing to Dane, while the kingdom of Dale was restored, with Bard as its new king, who went on to rebuild Lake Town, which became a thriving capital. These two newly reformed nations would become true bastions of the north in the ensuing war against Sauron. While Gandalf had achieved all of his goals, foremost among them the destruction of Smaug, who Sauron could have used to devastating effect during the War of the Ring. Throughout the Third Age, the kingdoms of Gondor and Rohan continued to grow closer as allies. However, the increasing influence of Sauron led to coordinated attacks against the remaining human kingdoms, preventing them from helping each other. The Dunlendings, who were the original inhabitants of Calenardon, which became Rohan, were driven north by Orl's people and proved to be a threat. Invading the region from the west, they took the abandoned Númenórean fortress of Isengard in 2710 of the Third Age. Rohan was then ruled by King Helm Hammerhand. One of his vassals, Freka, was growing strong in the west, and in 2754 demanded the hand of Helm's daughter for his son Wulf. The king refused and mocked Freka, which prompted a duel between the two, during which the noble was killed. Enraged, Helm declared Freka's family the enemies of the king, forcing Wulf to run away and join the Dunlendings. We don't know how, but Wulf soon became the leader of the Dunlendings and built an alliance with the Easterlings and the Corsairs of Umbar, possibly helped by Sauron. During the so-called Long Winter of 2758, Corsairs and Haredrim attacked Gondor, preventing it from coming to Rohan's aid, while Wulf and his allies attacked the Horse Lords. Unable to defend against the overwhelming numbers, Helm was defeated at the crossings of Isen. The majority of the Rohirrim fled to the fortress Suthburg, which would be known as Hornburg or Helm's Deep afterwards, while Edoras was defended by the king's son, Haleth. Wulf soon killed Haleth and took the capital, declaring himself the king. His armies besieged Suthburg, leading to a long and costly winter investment. It is said that Helm fought ferociously, leading countless sallies against the enemy, but hunger and dwindling numbers were too much, and sometime in early 2759 the king died, along with many of his people. The details are lost, but the siege was lifted either by the Rohirrim or because the Dunlendings got tired of maintaining it. Regardless, the long winter was finally over in March of 2759, and Helm's nephew, Freolaf Hildason, used the spring floods and led a contingent of Rohirrim down from Dunharrow, where a group of his people had survived, towards Edoras. Taking the Dunlendings entirely by surprise, they routed the defending force, killing Wulf and successfully reclaiming their capital. It is at this point a force of Gondorians joined with Freolaf's troops, and their combined might prevailed over the invaders, sending them back to the western wastes. Freolaf was then crowned king, with an unlikely visitor coming to the coronation, Saruman the White, greatest of the wizards of Middle-earth, bearing gifts and expressing admiration for the courage of the Horse Lords. Seeing the weaknesses in the western defences of Rohan, Steward of Gondor, Beren, bestowed the fortress of Isengard to Saruman alongside the Palantir and all other items which could be found within its ancient walls. Freolaf was happy with this arrangement, as the war had been costly in terms of men and horses, while Saruman would provide a stable ally and wise counsel. Further issues arose for the Rohirrim, as the Orcs, who had been driven from the north during the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, found their way to Rohan. This led to numerous raids and much suffering on the part of the Horse Lords, until the destruction of the last great Orc hold in Rohan by King Folka in TA 2864. It was under the reign of Folka's son, Folkwin, that Rohan finally returned to its earlier stability and strength. Fortunately, this was just in time for the Rohirrim to aid Gondor when the Haredrim invaded yet again in 2885. Folkwin sent his sons, Folkred and Fastred, to lead the forces of Rohan against an immense army of the Haredrim. Although the combined forces of Gondor and Rohan ultimately prevailed at the Battle of the Crossing of Poros, the allied losses were immense, and both Folkred and Fastred were slain. So it was Folkwin's youngest son, Fengel, who took up the crown of Rohan, weakening the kingdom by squabbling with his advisors and warriors alike, undoing much of the work of his father. Meanwhile, in what was formerly Arnor, the descendants of the last king of Edui, now known as the Dunedain, protected the remaining inhabitants of the region from the horrors surviving these great northern wars. They were known as the Rangers of the North, highlighting the ignorance of the men and hobbits who populated the land. Aranath, the son of the last king of Arnor, had taken up the mantle of chieftain of the Dunedain, and since his passing there had been 16 more such chieftains. Hunters in the dark and protectors of the people, they slew orcs and abominations, unwilling to surrender to the tide of evil. With each conflict their numbers dwindled, and by the chieftainship of Arathorn, the once mighty defenders of the north were a mere shadow of their former prowess. However, Arathorn's son, Aragorn II, would prove to be the greatest of their number. Following the death of Arathorn during a battle with an orc raiding party, the 2-year-old Aragorn was sent to Rivendell to be fostered by his distant relative Elrond. However, at the request of his mother, his lineage was kept a secret. When he was 20, it was revealed that he was the last descendant of Anarion and Isildur's one true heir, with Elrond bestowing upon the young man the shards of Narsil. It was also around this time the young chieftain met and fell in love with Elrond's daughter, Arwen. Aragorn met with the wizard Gandalf the Grey in 2956, and the latter advised him to instruct the Dunedain to guard the Shire, where the hobbits lived, at all costs. From 2957 to 2980, Aragorn served in the army of Rohan, using the name Thorongil, under the newly crowned King Thengel, and met the young Prince Theoden. He fought with such valour that it increased the morale of the Free Peoples, and actively countered the rising strength of Mordor in the east. Unfortunately, at this time Saruman's use of the Palantir led to his corruption by Sauron. He began to make trouble for the Rohirrim, and openly declared himself to be the Lord of Isengard. Sauron, fully ensconced in his fortress at Barad-dûr, was breeding massive armies of orcs, and drawn to him were his most powerful servants, the 9 Ringwraiths. The preparations for the coming war were nearing completion. Aragorn then moved to Gondor, becoming a lieutenant in the army, and beloved by his men, he led a force to Umbar in 2980, burning the Corsair fleet and preventing an invasion of Gondor. However, soon after, he left his post to the disappointment of his men and went east. Arriving in Lorien, he asked Arwen to marry him. His proposal was accepted, but Elrond refused his permission until such a time that Aragorn would be king of Arnor and Gondor. Meanwhile, Gandalf visited his old friend Bilbo during his 111th birthday in 3001 and convinced the Hobbit to leave the ring to his nephew Frodo, with Bilbo embarking on one of his final journeys to Rivendell, where he would enjoy some well-earned rest. Gandalf at this stage had become increasingly suspicious of the ring, fearing that it may in fact be more than just a mere ring of power. Gandalf asked Aragorn to leave the Rangers to watch over the Shire and hunt down the previous owner of the ring, Gollum. In 3017, Aragorn captured Gollum in the Dead Marshes and brought him to the halls of Thranduil in Mirkwood. Gollum was questioned by Gandalf here, revealing that he had earlier been captured and interrogated by the Dark Lord, revealing the words Shire and Baggins during his torture. Alarmed by this, Gandalf made with all haste to the Shire, and in his absence, an orc attack allowed Gollum to escape and make his way to the mines of Moria. Gandalf's suspicions started to be confirmed. The full strength of Mordor had returned, and the weakened states of Rohan and Gondor were at a severe disadvantage, as Sauron both had superior numbers and managed to surround them by enemies on all sides. Sauron was also an adept strategist, and while his initial plans to utilize Smaug had been rendered impotent by Gandalf and his company, he still held the upper hand. The Dark Lord decided to use his strength to destroy the Kingdom of Gondor, which was his strongest opponent despite years of decay and stagnation at the hands of the stewards. Osgiliath was a shell of its former glory following years of war, and the increased importance and focus placed upon the new capital of Minas Tirith. It would be vital in any such attack on Gondor. Positioned on the Anduin River, it provided the only proper crossing point for hundreds of miles either up or downstream. Half of the city lay on either side of the river, and as such it would prove no easy task to take the fortress city. If the city should fall, it would open up the Gondorian capital to a direct assault, which at this stage of the war may have proved fatal given the disunity of the forces of man. Sauron, however, was extremely patient, and rather than reveal the utmost extent of his forces, preferred to use the assault as a probing one in order to test the strength of the steward Denethor II, who he had begun to influence through the Palantir years earlier. This also provided the perfect cover for the Nazgûl to cross the Anduin unnoticed in their journey towards the Shire in search of the ring. The first true battle of the War of the Ring began with a massive army of orcs, Easterlings and Haradrim, led by the Witch King of Angmar himself, assaulting the eastern bank. The sons of the Steward and captains of Gondor, Boromir and Faramir, were entirely blindsided by this assault, but they managed to hastily mount a defense, showing skill and valor. Soon, the untold numbers began to weigh upon the disciplined professional soldiers of Gondor who were supported by the Rangers of Ithilien. Unable to hold ground in fear of the Witch King, the Gondorians were pushed back to the riverbank by the former King of Angmar's forces. Seeing no other alternative, Faramir and Boromir gave the order for the last bridge over the Anduin to be destroyed, while they led a desperate rearguard action, hoping to buy enough time for the bridge to be brought down. The fighting was fierce as the stalwart Gondorians refused to give an inch, willing to fight to the last man, as each and every one of them were aware of what the consequences of their failure might be. Fortunately, it was just enough to save the western portion of the city, and seeing that the bridge had been destroyed, the two brothers, alongside the surviving 2 soldiers of their company, launched themselves into the powerful flow of the Anduin and just about managed to swim to the other bank. The eastern portion of the city was now fully under Sauron's control, opening up the possibility of the entire city falling. Gandalf at this point received news from another wizard, Radagast the Brown, that his presence was requested by his superior, Saruman the White. Gandalf wrote a letter to Frodo, urging him to leave the Shire with all haste before making his way to Isengard. His message never arrived, and Frodo decided to leave for Bree himself. Accompanied by fellow hobbits Samwise Gamgee, Peregrine Took, and Meriadoc Brandybuck, he barely evaded the Nazgul who had been sent to capture him. When the hobbits reached the Prancing Pony Inn in Bree, they were dismayed to discover that Gandalf was not there. They were instead greeted by a mysterious ranger known as Strider. Unbeknownst to them, Saruman had been swayed by the Dark Lord and desired the power of the ring for himself, and when Gandalf refused to join him, Saruman imprisoned Gandalf the Grey on the highest level of his tower, Orthanc. Gandalf was rescued by his dear friend, the leader of the Great Eagles, Gwaihir. Meanwhile, Aragorn was escorting the hobbits towards Rivendell. At the watchtower of Weathertop, they were attacked by the Nazgul. The Witch King stabbed Frodo before Aragorn and the hobbits drove them off. This put Frodo's life in immediate danger, forcing the group to move with all haste towards Rivendell in order to avail of elvish healing, with the Ringwraiths in pursuit. They were met by the elf lord Glorfindel, who drove off 4 Nazgul chasing them, escorting the party to the ford of the Bruinen. Here, Elrond unleashed a flood, driving off the servants of Sauron and buying them enough time to save Frodo's life. So began the Council of Elrond on October 25, 3018, wherein the representatives of the Free Peoples discussed what to do with the ring. Eventually, it was decided that it had to be destroyed in Mount Doom, where it was forged. Dwarf Gimli, son of Gloin, Elven Prince of the Woodland Realm, Legolas, and Boromir of Gondor joined Frodo, Merry, Pippin, Sam, Aragorn, and Gandalf, becoming known as the Fellowship of the Ring. On the 25th of December, they set out from Rivendell upon a quest that would determine the fate of all of Middle-earth. Unable to traverse the Gap of Rohan due to the proximity of Saruman, and also blocked from taking the Pass of Caredras due to a snowstorm conjured by the aforementioned wizard, they were forced to take the path of the Mines of Moria. They barely survived an attack by the Watcher in the Water, and their journey continued, and a number of days later they came upon the chamber of Mazarbul, with Gollum tailing them through the entire ordeal, wherein stood the tomb of Balin, who had served in the company of Thorin Oakenshield and attempted to retake his ancestral home, but died with his comrades in the process. Unfortunately, Pippin's clumsiness revealed the presence of the Fellowship, and a battle ensued as a company of orcs, led by a troll, attempted to storm the chamber. The group won the battle and fled. However, it was not just orcs which Pippin had awoken. Durin's Bane, the last of the great Balrogs of Morgoth, now pursued them. Reaching the bridge of Khazad Dûm, the Balrog revealed itself, and Gandalf the Grey stepped forward to meet it, shouting aloud, "You cannot pass! I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arnor. You cannot pass. The dark fire will not avail you. Flame of Udun, go back to the shadow. You cannot pass." Baiting the Balrog onto the narrow bridge above the chasm, he smote it with his staff and cast the fiery beast down, before being caught by its whip and dragged in. His last words to his companions were, "Fly, you fools." Elsewhere, Saruman had finally forged an army in order to set himself up as an equal to Sauron. In doing so, he had torn down the trees within Isengard and the surrounding area in order to fuel his forges of industry. He ordered Orcish and Dunlending raids upon the ailing kingdom of Rohan, whose king he had begun to corrupt and sway towards inaction and frailty. The culmination of his experiments on the orcs was the fighting Uruk-hai, a breed of half-orc, half-humans, who were many times stronger than their orcish brethren. Yet the true core of their strength lay in the fact that, unlike the orcs, they were totally unaffected by sunlight. Making use of this vital characteristic, he dispatched the strongest of his experiments to hunt down the Fellowship. Aragorn, who was now leader of the company, brought them to Lothlorien, where they were greeted by Galadriel, the fairest of all the elves. Frodo offered her the ring, but she resisted the temptation, instead aiding the Fellowship, bestowing upon them a number of gifts. The Fellowship passed the famous statues of Argonaths and continued down the river Anduin, setting up camp on the western side of the Lake of Nen Hithol. Unfortunately, Boromir had been slowly seduced by the power of the ring. Despite his innate virtues, the weakness that had swayed Isildur so many years before was alive in him. Giving in to his weakness, he attempted to take the ring from Frodo, but the Hobbit put on the ring and used the invisibility it was granting to hide from the captain of Gondor. Realizing that his actions were due to the taint of the One Ring, Boromir returned to the camp, sorrowful for what had just transpired between himself and the ring-bearer, only to be confronted by Aragorn. Attempting to present his version of events, the rest of the Fellowship clearly believed that there was more to the argument. However, Aragorn refused to press the issue further. The Fellowship then scattered in a misguided attempt to find the ring-bearer, with Boromir being tasked with protecting Merry and Pippin, while Aragorn raced after Sam, who feared desperately for Frodo's safety. Fleeing from the initial encounter with Boromir, and believing he should now take the ring by himself, Frodo met with Samwise Gamgee, who refused to let his dear friend depart without him, and both of them crossed to the eastern bank. This was only allowed by the distraction caused by Merry and Pippin, who had run into a group of Uruk-hai. Boromir came to their aid, and was initially able to drive off the party of orcs. More and more Uruks came to assault the group, however, believing the two hobbits to be the ones they had been tasked with retrieving by Saruman. Fighting like a man possessed, Boromir held off swathes of Uruk-hai warriors while the two hobbits threw stones at the oncoming enemy forces in order to earn their companions some more time. Unable to defeat Boromir in hand-to-hand combat, the Uruk-hai proceeded to shoot at him with black arrows from behind, eventually bringing the Gondorian down, though not before he broke his blade in combat, slaying one more Uruk before he could stand no longer. He did not die, though, and was forced to look on as the hobbits were taken, the Uruk-hai now taking them to their master in Isengard and what they believed to be the ring-bearer. Aragorn arrived first, with all of the Uruk-hai having already left, and came upon his now dying companion, who lay against a tree, pierced all over by black arrows and carrying his broken sword. His final words to Aragorn before he passed urged the heir of Isildur to take up the mantle only he could truly carry. "Farewell, Aragorn. Go to Minas Tirith and save my people. I have failed." With this passed Boromir, the eldest son of the steward Denethor. The remnants of the shattered Fellowship prepared a short funeral for their fallen brother, placing his body alongside his shattered horn and sword before allowing the tide to bring him over the falls and unto rest, before turning towards Rohan and giving pursuit in order to recover the captured hobbits. Meanwhile, Frodo and Sam continued their journey ever eastwards, stalked by a cunning Gollum and entirely unsure of the way they must take. Following the fierce confrontation between Gandalf and the Balrog of Morgoth at the bridge of Khazad-dûm, they both fell into the depths of the mountain. Gandalf was burned by the flaming entity on this long fall, before plunging into an icy cold lake, which almost stilled him, but he continued the fight. Weakened by the ice-cold water, the Balrog flared up the endless stair before arriving upon the highest point in Durin's tower where the final fight happened. The fighting was brutal, but Gandalf drew upon his last ounce of strength and struck down his enemy, finally bringing an end to the hateful legacy of Morgoth, master of Sauron and the greatest of all evil. The battle had taken 10 days, and Gandalf lay broken upon the rocks, his life force slowly fading away following the duel. His body eventually gave in to the weight of time and the immensity of his wounds, yet his spirit did not perish. He was the Istari sent to Middle-earth by the creator of the world, and his mission was deemed to be incomplete in the face of the rising tides of darkness in the Third Age. So he was returned to Middle-earth with far greater strength than he had upon his initial landing in Middle-earth. Gandalf was later found by the Lord of the Eagles, Gwaihir, and brought to Lothlorien, where the remainder of his wounds were healed in their entirety. The elves bestowed upon him new robes of white, signifying that in the face of the betrayal of Saruman, he was now chief among the Istari. Armed with a new staff of immense power, Gandalf the White set out to turn the tide of the War of the Ring. In the meantime, Frodo and Sam, having been lost in the crags of the Emyn Muil for some time, were ambushed by the former wielder of the ring, Gollum. They defeated the broken shell of a hobbit, but despite Sam's urging, Frodo refused to kill the deranged being, the pity which had stayed Bilbo's hand years earlier, guiding him. Instead, Gollum was forced to swear an oath on the ring to serve its master, Frodo, and act as a guide for the two hobbits. With his guidance, they soon reached the location of the Great Battle of Dagorlad, fought during the War of the Last Alliance. This area, now known as the Dead Marshes, was disorienting, and without Gollum finding a hidden path, they would not have been able to cross the swamps. Yet even here the eye of Sauron was keen as ever, with the Lord of Nazgul flying overhead upon a fell beast searching for the ring. Meanwhile, Aragorn, Gimli and Legolas made their way to Rohan, once a realm of honor, now altered fundamentally due to the treachery of Saruman, its military unrecognizable to Aragorn, who had served with it decades before. King Theoden, who had shown such promise at a young age, had grown old and weary, as by the time of the War of the Ring he had reigned for 40 years. Unbeknownst to the noble king, his chief counselor, a native of Rohan, Grima, who soon was to be nicknamed Wormtongue, was in the employ of Saruman, and was slowly poisoning Theoden's food, slowly corrupting his mind and weakening both the king and the kingdom. His strategic advice of constant retreat left the countryside defenseless. The king himself was kept in the palace, leaving the protection of the realm in the hands of Theoden's son Theodred and his nephew Eomer. Saruman recognized the need to remove this last bastion of heroism and valor in Rohan, and soon set in motion his plan to destroy the Rohirrim. The defenders of the realm knew that they had to keep the crossings over the River Isen in order to prevent the unification of the enemy forces. The crossing point on the River Isen was crucial, as it was the only such point at which a large army could cross, and Saruman had already managed to sneak a small force across to gain a foothold. Theodred learned of this and secretly moved the troops directly under his command to get rid of that threat. On February 23, 1319 of the Third Age, the Riders of Rohan scored an easy victory here, destroying the enemy unit. In the aftermath, Theodred initially displayed the tactical acumen of his ancestor Eorl, and decided to defend the crossings against any future incursions. However, soon the young prince heard of a great force gathering in Isengard. On the 24th of February, attempting to preempt this massive force assaulting Rohan, Theodred left 3 companies of cavalry to guard the ford, taking with him 8 companies of cavalry and a company of bowmen to meet the forces of the wizard. Unfortunately for him, Saruman had already amassed his forces and was able to send a detachment to the west to lie in wait for the force of Rohan. Theodred unwittingly walked into the trap laid for him. Initially, his horsemen crushed a force of orcs 20 miles north of the fords, but with that, the prince dashed headlong into the main Isengard host. The riders of Rohan still had a chance to win this engagement, but soon they were attacked by the ambushing force. Their flank lost cohesion and they suffered many casualties. Seeing his position was untenable, Theodred ordered a retreat to the fords, with the orcs and Uruk-hai in fierce pursuit. Here, Grimbold was given command of the troops on the western side of the river, with Theodred forming up on a small hilly islet in the centre of the fords in order to cover Grimbold should he be forced to retreat. But Isengard had another army on the eastern side of the Isen, and a flanking force of wargs and 2 battalions of orcs attacked the Rohirrim here, forcing the riders to flee south along the river, being chased by the orcs the entire time. The remainder of the orcs on the eastern bank, alongside a large number of Dunlending raiders, then crashed into Theodred's rear, while Grimbold's forces were simultaneously attacked on the western bank. Surrounded and outnumbered, Theodred cried for help, exclaiming, "To me, Eolingus!" His call was answered by Grimbold, who led a small contingent towards the hill to save his liege. Grimbold, however, would arrive too late, only to see Theodred mortally wounded by an orc, who Grimbold in his fury struck down. The de facto leader of the Rohirrim now found himself in the same position as the son of the king, surrounded and likely to be slaughtered at any given moment. That is, until a horn was sounded on the eastern bank with the rising of the sun. Another distinguished captain of Rohan, Elfhelm, led 4 companies of cavalry from Edoras and surprised Saruman's forces, who were blinded by the burning light of the sun, always dangerous for the orcs. Isengard's soldiers believed they had been attacked by a far greater host, with many fleeing. 2 companies were sent to slaughter the fleeing orcs, while Elfhelm led the remainder of his forces to relieve Grimbold on the hill, thundering into the Dunlendings, who threatened to overwhelm the beleaguered defenders. The Dunlendings were slaughtered to a man, and Elfhelm arrived just in time to prevent Grimbold's death at the hands of a Dunlending pike. Unfortunately, Theodred lay dying, and the 2 captains of Rohan knelt beside him as he gave his final words before dying moments later. "Let me lie here to protect the fords until Eomer arrives." Theodred's body was buried where he fell so he could guard the fords in perpetuity, while his death made Eomer the heir to the throne of Rohan. Still, Isengard had more than enough forces to threaten Rohan. After the first Battle of Isen, the command of the forces garrisoned there was given to Erkenbrand of the Westfold. However, until such time as he would arrive from Helm's Deep, command was shared between Elfhelm and Grimbold. Erkenbrand, a warrior of high esteem, who had previously retired from service but returned to his post seeing the threat posed to Rohan, left a force of 1,000 warriors to guard Helm's Deep, and ordered a general retreat of the populace to the fortress before heading out to assume his command. While he was on his way, Grimbold was still leading the force at Isen. He stationed his foot soldiers at the ford, and the remainder of his men with Elfhelm on the eastern bank, where he assumed the attack would come. The force sent by Saruman was comparatively small, but still far outnumbered the Rohirrim garrisoned there. In early March, the wizard's soldiers attacked, forcing Grimbold to retreat across the ford with heavy casualties. Rohan's infantry, helmed by its leader, made their last stand here, assuming aid would come from Elfhelm. However, warg riders had made their way through the gap in the 2 flanks and threatened to surround Elfhelm's force. Elfhelm, aware of the danger posed to Grimbold, still sounded the retreat in the face of inevitable encirclement. Seeing the torches on the other bank, Grimbold now knew the full might of Isengard was set to bear down upon his position. He also retreated back to his camp, where a shield wall was formed. The forces of Isengard broke upon this redoubt time and again, Yet the captain of Rohan knew he could not maintain this line indefinitely. Forming two groups of riders, he sent them to simultaneously attack both the north and south enemy flanks, and in the ensuing confusion, his troops were able to flee the battlefield and join up with the remnants of the army now commanded by Erkenbrand. While the army was preserved by the brave conduct of Grimbold, Rohan now lay open for invasion. Still, Saruman's plan had been delayed, which probably saved the Rohirrim. The army of Erkenbrand was still in the field, but it wasn't capable of stopping Isengard's advance, and Rohirrim slowly dispersed around the countryside. While these battles were raging, Eomer and his Ered, which was a company of 120 riders of Rohan, had been tracking down a company of Uruk-hai and orcs who had been carrying Merry and Pippin to Isengard. The mounted Rohirrim were fast, and the fact that there was no unity among the enemy forces helped them gain ground. Indeed, the group about to be attacked by Eomer consisted of Saruman's Uruk-hai and a mixed group of orcs from Moria and Mordor, led by Grishnak. These factions had their own disagreements, as Morian orcs wanted to kill the hobbits to avenge their brethren killed by the Fellowship, while the leader of the Uruk-hai, Ugluk, had orders to bring them to Saruman. At the same time, Grishnak suspected that Ugluk's prisoners were connected to the ring, and was eager to bring them to his master in Mordor. At this point, the orcs stopped and started arguing on their course of action, allowing Eomer's scout to notice them and gallop to his commander to bring the news. The argument the enemy was having ended in the only way it could have, and Ugluk killed some of the orcs to show how serious he was about fulfilling his master's orders. The orcs and Uruk-hai would have probably continued fighting amongst themselves, but they noticed the approaching Rohan horsemen and decided that it was time to flee. Their best hope was to enter the nearby forest, which they hoped would negate the speed of the Rohirrim. Eomer was outnumbered 2 to 1, but his troops were clearly superior. To not allow the orcs to escape, the horsemen hemmed the enemy in along the river Entwash and started pushing them northwest. The orcs, already tired from their long trek, started to slow down as the pursuit continued. The stragglers were shot by the Rohirrim arrows as the horsemen moved in to kill and then retreated to avoid the orcish bows. Finally, Ugluk's creatures reached a small hill outside the forest of Fangorn, which they encamped on. Eomer didn't attack immediately, probably not wanting to lose any of his men, but still surrounded the orcs on 3 sides. Not really fond of the forests, the orcs were not eager to enter Fangorn, but Ugluk still sent a few to scout ahead. None of them returned, and Ugluk decided to abandon his initial idea. Hoping that the hobbits could be used as hostages, he loudly ordered his orcs to kill them if the Rohirrim attempted to attack. Eomer sent in a few of his scouts, who crawled into the orcish camp, killing a few and then disappearing. This distracted Ugluk, and his rival Grishnak used that to try and escape with the hobbits. However, he was discovered by a rider of Rohan and killed. The whole commotion in the orcish camp made the Rohirrim close in a little bit, and it was then that a new unit of Uruk-hai entered the fray. Mauhur was leading one of the scouting parties sent by Saruman to find Ugluk and assist him, but he would ultimately fail, as Eomer sent in his reserve, whose charge easily scattered the Uruk-hai. At dawn, the Rohirrim finally attacked the enemies on the hill, and Ugluk's soldiers shot the last of their arrows, killing a few. Ugluk amassed his best warriors and attempted to break out of the encirclement. Initially, his counterattack worked, and more riders were killed, but soon Eomer approached the leader of the Uruk-hai, dismounted and started dueling him, soon slaying the killer of Boromir. The last few orcs who attempted to flee were slaughtered. In the confusion of the battle, the 2 hobbits had escaped into the forest, and here they were met by the chief of the Ents, Treebeard, and Gandalf the White, who let them accompany Treebeard to the Entmoot, which would decide whether they would fight in the war to come. Outside of the forest, Eomer met with Aragorn's group the next day, and provided them with 2 horses, before returning to Edoras, where he recounted his meeting with the ranger, the elf, and the dwarf. For failing to capture and bring these fugitives to Edoras, he was beaten and imprisoned. Left disheartened, and believing the hobbits to be dead, Legolas and Gimli were despondent, a stark contrast to Aragorn, whose superior tracking skills led him to believe that the hobbits yet lived. The three entered the forest, but instead of the hobbits, they found the newly resurrected Gandalf. The wizard knew that he needed to help Rohan in this war if the forces of good hoped to win. So, summoning the greatest of all horses in Middle-earth, Shadowfax, and with all haste, the four of them made their way to Edoras. Arriving at the Great Hall and seeing a defeated people, Gandalf realized that Theoden was being corrupted. He deposed the king's advisor Grima, casting him out of the city, freeing Éomer and healing the effects of the poison on Theoden. With the king healed and now clear of mind, they had to decide what to do next to save Rohan. Gandalf knew that Theoden didn't have enough forces to fight an open battle, and advised him to move to the impregnable Helm's Deep, while he himself rode to find Erkenbrand. Initially, the king wanted to ignore the wizard's counsel, so he left 1,000 soldiers to defend Edoras, while the civilian population was ordered to move to Dun Harrow under the command of his niece Éowyn. The king's host moved towards Isen to reinforce it, but met the survivors of the Battle of the Ford. It was clear that defending at Helm's Deep was the only choice the Rohirrim had left, so Theoden started moving there. Despite being advised by Grima that the walls of the fortress were impenetrable, Saruman had devised a solution with his sorcery, the fires of Orthanc, immensely destructive explosives. If placed in the weak spot of the deeping wall, a culvert that allowed water to pass from the glittering caves out of the fortress, the fires of Orthanc would destroy it. While the armies of Rohan and Isengard were on their way to fight a decisive battle at Helm's Deep, the ancient race of Ents was deliberating what actions they should take, and after 3 days, the Ent Moot decided that they would attack Isengard in what came to be known as the Last March of the Ents. Theoden arrived at Helm's Deep and met with the commander of the fortress in the absence of Erkenbrand, Gamling the Old, who had of varying quality. Gamling the Old, who had of the finest fighters, had followed Erkenbrand to the fords. With the forces of Theoden, the Rohirrim numbered just under 3,000 soldiers, defences to be fully manned. Saruman's army consisted of Uruk-hai, the wild men of Dunland, orcs and half-orcs, and due to casualties suffered at the fords, was reinforced prior to arrival, meaning the 10,000 Uruk-hai and their auxiliary forces arrived on the 3rd of March. Despite the best preparations of those now standing atop the walls of the Hornburg, the situation remained a desperate one, causing Legolas to finally turn aside the lifelong enmity of the elves towards their Dwarven counterparts and speak faithfully to his companion. "But you comfort me, Gimli. I'm glad to have you standing nigh with your stout legs and your hard axe. I wish there were more of your kin among us, but even more would I give for 100 good archers of Mirkwood." Newly made friends decided to test each other's mettle by counting the enemies they would kill in the upcoming battle. The battle began with the Uruks attacking the first line of defences of Hornburg, known as the Helm's Dyke. This was an ancient trench and rampart, about a quarter of a mile below the fortress, and stretched for a mile or more across the valley. It was immensely steep in some places, reaching 20 feet high at its peak, and the gap in the middle was also extremely wide, allowing for Theoden's rearguard to exact heavy casualties before abandoning the fortification. They were able to fill the trench with corpses of Uruks and men of Dunland before retreating back to the fortress proper. Passing the dike, the Uruks launched a massive hail of crossbow bolts and arrows at the fortress, but received no reply. Deceived by the eerie silence of the defenders, they approached the fortifications and were surprised by a hail of arrows and rocks, forcing them to lose cohesion and break ranks. Yet even in this disordered state, and despite heavy losses, the weight of their numbers allowed them to push forward and assault the main gate using tree trunks as battering rams. The gate barely held, creaking and buckling under the pressure. Requiring time to shore up their defences, Theoden sent an advance party of Aragorn, Gimli and Éomer through a small side gate and out onto the causeway in order to buy time. The ploy was successful, and the heroes managed to cause casualties, but then were counterattacked, As Aragorn and Éomer attempted to retreat through the side gate, the Horse Lord was set upon by several orcs, and if not for the intervention of Gimli, would have been slain. The dwarves' timely attack pushed the enemy back yet again, allowing the trio to retreat. Despite the best attempts of the Uruk-hai, the gate was still standing, so the attacking force hefted hundreds of ladders up against the deeping wall, and set about scaling the sprawling fortification. The defenders, who were already exhausted by the persistent fighting at this point, threw back assault after assault upon the battlements. Again, seeing the valour of men, a number of smaller orcs were sent by their Uruk commanders to crawl through the culvert and attack the defenders from behind. Gimli and Gamling led a company of men from the Westfold and slaughtered the orcs who had crawled through, bringing Gimli's tally to 21 kills, while Legolas now had 24. The company then set about blocking the culvert with stones and rocks to prevent such an attack. However, it is at this point that the sorcery of Saruman played its part. Placing the fires of Orthanc by the wall, a berserker was sent to set it ablaze. Although Legolas did the best he could with his bow, he wasn't able to bring down the torchbearer in time. The explosion brought down the culvert along with a large part of the deeping wall, leaving Gimli and his company isolated, while also bringing the fortress's defences to its knees. A massive host of Uruk-hai poured through the breach, and the defenders on the ground, led by Gimli, Éomer and Gamling, were pushed back into the glittering caves. Meanwhile, Aragorn and Legolas, who were atop the wall at the time of the explosion, engaged in a fighting retreat towards the keep, barely avoiding being overrun, with Legolas being forced to save Aragorn's life from an orc's blade. At this exact time, the Entish assault on Isengard began, with Treebeard leading from the front, accompanied by Merry and Pippin, who acted as rock throwers from on high. The rage of the Ents was incomparable, as they had first been created at the request of Yavanna, one of the Ainur and Valar, in order to protect her trees from the newly created race of the Dwarves, and had been taught the common tongue by the elves of old. Their strength was also unmatched, with Treebeard boasting that when roused to violence, they were stronger than any troll, with Morgoth having created the trolls in order to produce a force capable of matching them and failing in this regard. Following on from the Ent Moot within Fangorn Forest in Durndingle, the Ents decided to vent their fury at their failure to fulfill their duty in shepherding the trees, and with a common purpose of vengeance never before witnessed among the Ents, their fury drove them to enter the War of the Ring. With Isengard having been emptied due to the assault on the Hornburg, their defences were no match for the might of the Ents, accompanied by a sizable contingent of Huorns. Huorns were an ancient race of slow-moving trees who the Ents had cared for throughout the Second and Third Ages. Obeying their shepherds, they descended upon Isengard as a great dark forest, striking fear into the hearts of the token garrison left in Isengard, as the majority of the force had marched to join the Battle of the Hornburg. Treebeard and company tore down the walls of Isengard and created a dam over the Wizard's Vale, destroying the pits, mines and weapons of war which Saruman had accumulated, effectively cleansing the taint of darkness from the valley. Yet they were unable to break down the Tower of Orthanc, which had been forged by the Númenóreans, and as such, Saruman was effectively left as their prisoner. When news reached Sauron of this setback, he planned upon the reclamation of Isengard, following on from his ultimate victory, to grant the Tower of Orthanc to his loyal black Númenórean servant, the Mouth of Sauron. The situation in Helm's Deep was far grimmer. Gimli, Éomer and Gamling, and their company, barely kept the Uruk-hai at bay during the night within the glittering caves, while Theoden, Aragorn, Legolas and the surviving defenders were holed up in the keep, as the Uruk-hai prepared to make one final push through their defences the following day. Aragorn appeared just before dawn to offer parley, stating that if the Uruk-hai lay down their weapons, they would be spared. Laughing at this suggestion, they attempted to feather the last line of Isildur with arrows, almost killing him in the process. Theoden now began to despair, before being reminded by his comrades of the need to fight on in spite of the current desperate circumstances. The descendant of Yol pondered upon what had become of the Rohirrim. Where now are the horse and the rider? Where is the horn that was blowing? Where is the helm and the hauberk and the bright hair flowing? Where is the harp on the harp string and the red fire glowing? Where is the spring and the harvest and the tall corn growing? They have passed like rain on the mountain, like a wind in the meadow. The days have gone down in the west, behind hills into shadow. Who shall gather the smoke of the dead wood burning, or behold the flowing years from the sea returning? Seeing that the defenders were desperate, the Uruk-hai broke down the gate of the keep, but were surprised to hear the horn of Helm Hammerhand sound in the deep. Their surprise did not last long, as Theoden, leading his riders alongside Aragorn and Legolas, burst forth and pushed the Uruk-hai back along the causeway. The men of Rohan were roused to particular fury by the words of their king, now restored to the full strength of his character and willing to lead them through whatever darkness lay ahead. Arise now, arise, riders of Theoden, dire deeds awake. Dark it is eastward, let horse be bridled, horn be sounded, forth Eorlingus! Simultaneously, upon hearing the horn of Helm Hammerhand, Gimli, Eomer and Gamling led their force out of the glittering caves, driving the Uruk-hai before them until they had retreated beyond the deeping wall. The Uruk-hai attempted to reform just beyond Helm's Dyke, as the two forces of Rohan converged to meet what was still a numerically superior foe in the field. The battle hung on a knife's edge, with the White Hand of Isengard still holding a significant advantage in terms of the force they could bring to bear. It is at this point that Gandalf appeared upon Shadowfax with the rising sun behind him. He had brought with him Erkenbrand and a force of 1,000 riders, battle-hardened survivors of the conflicts on the River Isen, led by their valiant captains Grimbold and Elfhelm. Likewise, an entirely newly arrived forest of strange trees blocked off the final avenue of escape. Following Gandalf's lead, the Eorlingus charged into the rear of the Uruk-hai, while Theoden and Eomer's forces supported the attack, crashing against the besiegers with all of the strength their exhausted soldiers could muster. The Sons of Yol would prove their valor once more, attacking the entrapped fighting Uruk-hai with a ferocity inspired by the men lost at the Fords of Isen and in the previous raids on their country. The Uruks soon lost cohesion and broke ranks, ensuring their slaughter, with the survivors fleeing into the newly emerged forest to their detriment. Less than half of the 10,000 Uruks were able to flee into the forest, where they were all annihilated by the Ents and their younger saplings, the Horns, ending the Uruk threat for good and all in the Riddermark. The battle was a costly victory for the men of Rohan, yet the power of Isengard was utterly shattered in the process. The Dunlendings laid down their weapons and were granted amnesty by King Theoden, which came as a massive surprise to the wild men, who had been told by Saruman that any men who surrendered would be burned alive by the Rohirrim. Those who surrendered were put to work repairing the Hornburg by Erkenbrand, before being sent back to their homes in Dunland. Saruman's power was now broken, as he remained prisoner within Orthanc, unable to influence the events of the War of the Ring ever again. The most important consequence of the battle was the establishment of Dwarven martial prowess over the elves, as Gimli overtook Legolas to win their contest by 42 Uruks killed to 41. While these battles were raging, Frodo, Sam and Gollum had safely traversed the Dead Marshes and made their way to Ithilien, where they were captured by the elite unit of the Gondorian army, the Ithilien Rangers. During an interrogation conducted by Faramir, Sam accidentally gave away the information that Frodo bore the ring, but fortunately for all involved, the captain of the Rangers proved his quality to be of the highest order. Recognizing the importance of their quest, he allowed the company to continue on their journey, which headed towards the Morgul Vale and from there into Mordor. He would face massive consequences for such an action from his father, but considered it a slight price to pay, stating, "But fear no more, I would not take this thing if it lay by the highway, not were Minas Tirith falling in ruin, and I alone could save her, so using the weapon of the Dark Lord for her good and my glory. No, I do not wish for such triumphs, Frodo, son of Drogo." Seeing his ally utterly destroyed, Sauron now turned his eye firmly upon Gondor and the gleaming white bastion of Minas Tirith. If Sauron's true strength could be brought to bear upon the city before Rohan could answer its call for aid, The Age of Man would fall, soon to be replaced by a final Dark Age of Sauron. Yet despite the might he could bring to bear upon the Gondorians, Sauron still knew fear, as the Ranger from the north looked set to take up his rightful mantle as King of Gondor, and the One Ring remained beyond his grasp and inching ever towards destruction. Following on from the Battle of the Hornburg, Gandalf, accompanied by Theoden, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Treebeard, Merry and Pippin, approached the imposing might of Isengard, which the Ents could not breach due to its superior Númenórean design, and confronted Saruman, who, spiteful and proud even in defeat, refused the pleas of Gandalf to surrender, forcing the White Wizard to reluctantly expel his former friend from the Order, destroying his staff and leaving him powerless. Grima Wormtongue also refused the mercy of King Theoden, instead hurling Saruman's palantir at the king, narrowly missing him. Ever curious, Pippin dived into the watery depths now encompassing the fortress, recovering the palantir which had been corrupted by Sauron. The young hobbit came face to face with the Dark Lord himself, but paralysed by fear, said nothing. Still, his presence confirmed the defeat of Saruman, driving an icy shard of fear into Sauron. In the meantime, Saruman was left to his own devices, with the Ents to serve as his keepers. Upon returning to Helm's Deep, the group was met by the Grey Company, consisting of the remaining 31 members of the Dunedain, led by Aragorn's lieutenant Halbarad, and the twin sons of Elrond, Elladan and Elrohir. They brought with them advice from Galadriel and Elrond, as well as a standard made by Arwen, depicting the white tree upon a black background, with a crown placed above the tree, symbolizing what was to come. The decision was made that the heir of Isildur must make his presence known to his greatest adversary. Gazing deep within the palantir, and holding the reforged blade, Andoril, Flame of the West, Aragorn confronted the Dark Lord, revealing that the heir of Isildur was soon to return as King of Gondor. Believing that Aragorn was now in possession of the One Ring, while also about to unite all of the free folk of Middle-earth behind his banner, the Dark Lord panicked. His well-laid plans were hastened, as he now saw the need for a preemptive strike on Gondor before Aragorn could assume the throne. Having been shown the sheer might of Sauron's forces through the Palantir, Aragorn was also forced to take desperate measures, in this instance departing the now rallying Rohirrim to walk the paths of the dead in order to save his people. Gandalf left the king to continue his muster, taking Pippin with him to Minas Tirith with all the haste his mount Shadowfax could muster, and before long they came before the Rammas Echor, or the Long Wall as it was often called. This fortification served as Minas Tirith's second line of defence should Osgiliath fall, consisting of a large wall which took an elliptical course around the plains of Pelenor. At its centre stood the Causeway Forts, twin towers that could be held against large numbers. Yet, in a sign of the decaying strength of the kingdom, these walls had been left to the elements for many years, and when passing through, Gandalf and Pippin witnessed hasty and desperate attempts to patch up the fortifications. Further adding to the woes of the Gondorians, they no longer possessed enough soldiers to man the unwieldy defences. Arriving at the city, Pippin was overtaken by its sheer size and majesty, yet Gandalf was not as impressed, seeing a city resigned to its defeat, as the majority of the citizenry had been sent out into the fiefdoms of the kingdom, and a rallying call had been sent out by the steward Denethor. However, the threat of an incoming fleet of corsairs from Umbar had severely limited the numbers sent from the outlying regions of Gondor. The muster itself amounted to 200 well-armed men from Lossarnach, 300 from Ringlow Vale, 500 bowmen from Morthond, 150 scantily equipped levies from Anfalas, 50 hillmen from Larnedon, 100 fisherfolk from Ethir Anduin, 300 from Pinath Gelin, and 1,200 men from Dol Amroth. The latter were led by the Prince of Dol Amroth, Imrahil, who immediately assumed a leadership role in the defence of the city. He brought with him the very flower of the Gondorian forces, the heavily armed and armoured Swan Knights, the only known horsemen in Middle-earth who could potentially best their Rohirrim allies. While each of these men did not lack for valour or the willingness to die for their land, their strength and numbers were lower than any time before. Arriving within the Tower of Ecthelion, Gandalf was left even more worried by the mental state of Denethor, steward of Gondor, who appeared to be completely distraught due to the death of his son Boromir, as well as the pervading influence of Sauron through his usage of the Palantir of Minas Tirith. Pippin, feeling responsible for the loss of the steward's son at the hands of the Uruk-hai at Amon-Hen, immediately pledged himself to the steward and was brought into Denethor's service. Meanwhile, Faramir had ordered his company of Rangers of Ithilien to reinforce the garrison of Osgiliath, and then returned to Minas Tirith, chased by the fell beasts of the Nazgul, and barely made it inside the walls due to the timely intervention of Gandalf, who flew through the gates of the city upon his steed Shadowfax. He revealed his true power upon that day, driving back the Nine with the might of his power, and even making the Witch King recoil in what resembled fear if he could still feel such a human emotion. Faramir then informed his father, as well as Gandalf and Pippin, of the survival of Frodo and Sam, as well as their continued travels towards the Morgul Vale. Denethor was furious with the failure of his son to bring the One Ring to Gondor, and lamented that he had lived and Boromir had not, before sending his son to hold the western portion of Osgiliath at all costs, a strategy which Faramir disagreed with, knowing that it most likely would cost him his life. Ever the most dutiful of sons, Faramir took up this responsibility, but not before saying to his father, "Then farewell, but if I should return, think better of me," and hearing, "That depends on the manner of your return," in response. Faramir returned to Osgiliath that same day, and began to make ready the defences of the city, of which they only maintained control of the western portion. The eastern portion lay in the hands of a massive horde of orcs, which was estimated to number between 70 and 100,000, and while overall command was given to the Witch King of Angmar, his lieutenant Gothmog was an adept strategist. He had commanded the orcs stationed on the eastern bank of the Anduin to create as many barges as they could, in order to ferry their forces over the mighty river. On the 9th and 10th of March, the Dark Lord sent a foul cloud from Mordor, covering the lands of Rohan and Gondor in darkness for 2 days, sapping the strength and will of the men of the West as the dawn never arrived. On the same day, a behemoth force emerged from the Black Gate, and force marched itself all the way to Caer Andros, capturing the island in the hopes of cutting off the Rohirrim relief force which had completed its muster at Dunharrow, while simultaneously another smaller army marched from Minas Morgul to bolster the forces at Osgiliath. Theoden had honoured the pledge of Eorl the Young and assembled 6,000 cavalrymen, among them his niece Eowyn and Merry, disguised among his riders. This was all he could manage in the time allotted to him, but it remained uncertain as to whether or not they would arrive in time. Meanwhile, Aragorn was leading the Grey Company, Gimli and Legolas, through the paths of the dead. His plan was to recruit the dead men of Dunharrow, who betrayed their oath to Isildur during the War of the Last Alliance. As the heir of Isildur, Aragorn had the ability to release them from their oath and undead existence, so the dead men joined him. At the same time, the Orcish host alongside their Haradrim reinforcements attacked Osgiliath on the 11th of March. The Rangers of Ithilien and Gondorian regulars made the hordes of orcs pay for every step they took through the former capital, and proved their worth despite the unfavourable odds. After a day of fighting, however, the weight of numbers soon took its toll, pushing the men of Gondor from the city and forcing them to take up further positions along the Rammas Echor. The fighting was at its fiercest at the Causeway Forts, as Faramir personally led the defence here, and knowing that time was of the essence, refused to give an inch of ground to the forces of Mordor. The Rammas Echor was too large a bastion to hold, given the numbers provided to the young captain of Gondor, and having held another day here, they were forced into a retreat on the 13th of March. What started as an orderly withdrawal soon turned into a rout, as the battered and broken forces of Gondor attempted to make their way back to the White City. Yet the Pelennor Fields offered no cover to Faramir or his men. They were overtaken by the forces of the Dark Lord, and a fierce melee ensued in which Faramir was struck down by a poisonous dart commonly used by the forces of the Southrons, and left near death. His men, loyal to their captain above all else, shielded his body and stood willing to fight to the last man if it meant saving their leader. This proved unnecessary, however, as Prince Imrahil led a sortie of his Swan Knights after getting Denethor's approval. The sheer ferocity and strength of these scions of an age long since past saved the lives of the remainder of the garrison of Osgiliath, their swan-shaped helms driving fear into the hearts of the Orcs and Southrons, who themselves turned to rout. With Gandalf once more driving off the Nazgul, who had grown to fear the light of Istari once more, Imrahil, coming upon the stricken body of his friend and nephew, hoisted Faramir upon his horse and rode back to the city with all haste in search of a healer. Upon hearing of his son's injury, Denethor finally gave way to madness, locking himself within the White Tower, preparing a pyre for himself and his son to burn upon, despite Pippin's protestations. That left the defense of the city to Gandalf, who was aided by the immensely capable Prince Imrahil, with the regular forces of Gondor joined by the survivors of the Rammas Echor. While the defeat at Osgiliath had been resounding, and Faramir's injury deprived them of another capable leader for the battle which was to come, the time he had bought in his desperate defense would prove pivotal in giving time for the Rohirrim to arrive and fulfill their oaths. This had been symbolized by the Red Arrow of Yol, which had been presented to King Theoden at Dunharrow, a gesture which once again called upon the old oaths of friendship to be fulfilled. Not long after the defeat at Rammas Echor and the near-mortal wounding of one of the last great captains of Gondor, Faramir, the forces of Mordor amassed upon the plains of Pelenor. The Witch King brought with him tens of thousands of orcs and men of Khand, Rhûn and Harad, alongside Oliphants and Trolls. They began to build siege equipment and dug trenches, while a sizable portion of the army, consisting of both orcs and Easterlings, was sent to protect the northern roads from the arrival of the Rohirrim. Here they also dug trenches and placed wooden spikes within them, in order to negate the advantage of the Rohirrim cavalry, which remained famed throughout all of Middle-earth, before settling into their fortifications. The siege began on the 13th of March, as the Witch King attempted to soften the defences of Minas Tirith with a massive bombardment of their walls. This initial attempt failed miserably, as the outer wall of the city, Othram, was built by the Númenóreans using black rock, and was as impregnable as the Tower of Orthanc. This forced the forces of Mordor to change tactics, and incendiary ammunition was fired over the wall, setting the lower city ablaze. The orcs also began firing salvos of the decapitated heads of the fallen at Osgiliath in an attempt to destroy the defenders' morale. In response to this, Gandalf, accompanied by Prince Imrahil, made circuits of the Othram, inspiring all who they met to remain steadfast despite the sheer size of the enemy at their gates. On the same day, Aragorn, meeting with the southern Gondorian army, took command and made his way to meet with the Corsair fleet, which was now bearing down on Minas Tirith. This force consisted of archers from the Blackroot Vale near Erich, infantry from Lebanon and Lamedon, and a number of other less distinguished units, yet their support would prove vital in the battle to come. The forces of the king intercepted the Corsair fleet at the famous port city of Pelargir in what would later become known as the Battle of Pelargir, which was Aragorn's first battle on Gondorian soil since he served in the employ of Denethor's father under the name of Thoringil many years past. The Corsairs, who were not famed for their discipline, had erred in stopping to loot and plunder every port town they came across during their journey towards Minas Tirith, and Aragorn's forces caught them right in the middle of just such an operation. The latter quickly divided his troops among his respective commanders, and they began to pick off the smaller looting parties of the Corsairs. At the same time, the forces of the dead cut a bloody swath through the Corsairs, who were struck by such fear that many jumped from their ships at the sight of the men of Dunharrow rather than face them. In this way, Aragorn quickly liberated the city, and now bolstered by the mariners of Pelargir, his troops could swiftly make their way up the Anduin to relieve the besieged Gondor. Aragorn was, however, a man of his word, and first released the Oathbreakers from their torment, announcing that their oaths had been fulfilled, before sending his makeshift flotilla on its way. While the first attempts at breaking the morale of the Gondorians had failed due to the leadership of Gandalf and Imrahil, the Easterlings, using their Mumakil, had pulled the siege towers closer to the wall during the night, and the next day would prove pivotal. The men of Gondor held firm, however, repulsing each wave of orcs and Easterlings respectively, destroying many of their siege towers in the process. Unfortunately for them, the necessity of defending the wall in its entirety from the siege towers meant that the Great Gate, which was the only weakness in the otherwise impenetrable wall, could not be defended sufficiently. Here Gandalf and Imrahil positioned themselves and led the defence of the gate, with the casualties on the part of the besiegers immense due to the unwillingness of the defenders to give any ground, in spite of the unending waves of foes they faced. While the odds seemed stacked against them, as no messenger had been received accounting for reinforcements, the Rohirrim had progressed farther than one would have expected in their attempts to reach the city. This was due to the aid of Gan Burigan, who was the chief of the Druedain of Druedan Forest, an ancient race of men who dwelt within the forest and refused to succumb to the corruption of the Dark Lord, despite his growing influence among the men of the West. Though small in number and in stature, they had warded off a large orcish force using hit-and-run tactics, as well as exceptionally potent poisoned arrows. When Theoden and his 6,000 arrived at the eaves of the forest, they were greeted by Gan Burigan and a company of his men, who warned him of the force who now blocked his path to Minas Tirith. Sensing the urgency of the situation, the chieftain wasted no time in leading the Riders of the Mark through the forest, bypassing the force of orcs and Haredrim, allowing them to arrive at the Rammas Echor at dawn on March 15th. The situation in Minas Tirith, despite the valiant efforts of its defenders, was worsening. The forces of Mordor had brought forth a great battering ram, known as Grond, named in honour of the warhammer which the original Dark Lord Morgoth had wielded in battle in times long since past. This Hammer of the Underworld had been forged in the foundries of Barad-dûr specifically for the purpose of bringing down the Great Gate of Minas Tirith. The siege work itself was 60 feet in height and 150 long. Created of harsh metals, it maintained a permanent flame in its wolf-like maw, evidencing the vile sorcery used in its creation, and would require a great many trolls to even operate it. Despite its sturdiness, the Great Gate was no match for the greatest siege equipment of the Third Age, and was weakened by the Witch King's sorcery. According to our primary source on the battle, thrice the great ram boomed, and suddenly upon the last stroke, the gate of Gondor broke. As if stricken by some blasting spell, it burst asunder. There was a blast of searing lightning, and the doors tumbled in riven fragments to the ground. The gate had been destroyed utterly, and the forces of the Dark Lord seemed poised to storm the city by force. The Witch King, upon his fell beast, entered the city first, believing the battle to be all but won. Standing before him in the Courtyard of Kings was Gandalf the White, mounted upon Shadowfax, who confronted the greatest servant of the Dark Lord and his endless tides, which were ready to destroy the greatest city of man. The Witch King was at first uncertain, having seen firsthand the power the White Wizard could bring to bear, so the standoff continued for what seemed like an unceasing moment in time. Just as the two looked set to finally test the prophecy uttered so long ago in Arnor, a horn was heard far off in the fields of Pelenor, a horn both the Witch King and the White Wizard recognized. The sons of Eorl had come forth with the future of Middle-earth now resting upon their intervention. The Witch King quickly fled the courtyard, sensing the gravity of the situation his forces now faced. However, Gandalf could not give pursuit, as he received ill news from Pippin of the fate of Faramir. Denethor, having made use of the Palantir one last time, finally had succumbed to the madness, and with his will now broke, sought to commit suicide. Unfortunately, believing his son was now dying, he sought to end Faramir's life alongside his, and had ordered a pyre to be constructed on which he would have them both burned. Pippin protested and was ejected from the room. In a panic, he ran to Beregond of the Citadel, whose love of Faramir overrode his sense of duty to the city, and he rushed into the burial chambers of the kings of Gondor, preventing the pyre from being burned, while Pippin sought out Gandalf's aid. When Gandalf arrived with Pippin, they saw that Beregond had been forced to slay several of the attendants in an attempt to delay the murder-suicide. Gandalf was able to save Faramir. However, the despair of Denethor was so great that even in knowing his son would survive, he elected to cast himself upon the pyre. So ended the life of Denethor, who would be remembered as a strong ruler who was corrupted by evil. King Theoden of Rohan emerged upon a hillock on the edge of the Pelennor Fields at the head of 6,000 riders of Rohan, where he looked down upon the doom of his age and did not falter, despite the immensity of the fight which now awaited the aged warrior king. The ranks of Orcs and Southrons now turned to face the new foe, which had emerged seemingly from nowhere. They had been caught unawares, and could not effectively reconfigure their formations to face what was to come. Theoden, turning to his men, organized his commanders, asking of them that they fear no darkness that day, before addressing the 6,000, now numbering as one of the greatest kings to ever have sat upon the throne of his forefathers. Arise, arise, riders of Theoden! Fell deeds awake, fire and slaughter, spear shall be shaken, shield be splintered, a sword day, a red day, ere the sun rises! The chant of death was taken up by the warriors of the Mark, as a cacophony of shouts, cheers and horn blasts filled the air, further breaking the morale of the forces of the Dark Lord. Before Theoden pulled his horse Snowmane once more to face the might of Sauron, with a light jolt to the side of his trusty mount, the horse jolted forward, and with this came a thundering of hooves that had never before been heard upon the field of Pelenor. 6,000 of Rohan crashed forward, first meeting the hordes of Orcs, which hastily arranged in a pike formation. The servants of Sauron were powerless to stop the flowing tide of cavalry, and were swept under the hooves of the king and his men with ease. Sensing the desperation of the situation, the great chieftain of the Haradrim mounted a countercharge, meeting Theoden head-on in brutal single combat. The fight dragged on, yet the old king did not falter, and struck down his enemy with all the vigour of a man half his age. The Haradrim were further slaughtered as the Rohirrim pushed ever onwards, destroying everything in their path and killing their king, until Theoden looked upon his final foe. The Witch King of Angmar, on his fell beast, swooped downward, mortally wounding the king under the weight of his beloved steed. The sheer terror the Lord of the Nazgul instilled caused Theoden's honour guard to rout, save for one who was known to his comrades as Denhelm throughout the march to Minas Tirith. It was in fact the king's niece, Eowyn, disguised as a man alongside the hobbit Merry. Unwilling to bow before the terror of the Nazgul, she boldly stood her ground, displaying the same courage her king had moments earlier. The Witch King then confidently stated that no living man can kill me, to which the Shield Maiden of Rohan removed her helmet and responded, "No living man am I, you look upon a woman. Eowyn I am, Eamond's daughter. Begone, if you be not deathless, for living or dark undead I will smite you if you touch him." Now she stood alone before the Lord of the Nine, and struck down his fell beast in defence of her beloved uncle, cleaving the beast's neck in one fell swing of her blade. The infuriated Witch King attacked Eowyn with great malice, hefting a large mace, and shattered her shield, breaking her arm in the process and forcing her back. It was at this point that Meriadoc Brandybuck stabbed the creature in the leg with the barrow blade he had picked up so long ago in his journey. The dagger was of the make of the land of Arnor and caused the Nazgul immense pain, bringing him to his knees, while also breaking Merry's arm with the force of the impact. Eowyn, then regaining her footing, thrust her blade through the Witch King's helm, finally fulfilling Glorfindel's prophecy at the Battle of Fornost that not by the hand of man would the leader of the Nine be defeated. Badly weakened by the fight, she succumbed to the Black Breath, which was a result of direct contact with a Nazgul, leaving her hovering close to death. Merry then dragged himself closer to the now dying King of Rohan, and was there to hear the dying words of Theoden, Lord of the Mark. "Farewell, Master Hobbit. My body is broken. I go to my fathers, and even in their mighty company, I shall not now be ashamed." Eomer, despite his heartbreak at the loss of his beloved uncle and the perceived loss of his sister, now assumed control of the Rohirrim. The charge, slowed but not stopped, continued to wreak devastation among the forces of Mordor. The men of Gondor began their own sortie from the gates, catching their foes unawares, and also inflicting heavy casualties upon the forces which were closest to the gate. First among them was Imrahil and his mounted Swan Knights, who cut a bloody swath through the forces of the Dark Lord in an attempt to reach Eomer. The fighting grew bloody and desperate, as the immense weight of the Mumakil and Haradrim, alongside the reserves of the Orcs, kept the men of the West separated, allowing the numerical advantage to once more turn the battle in favour of the servants of the Dark Lord, even in the absence of their overall commander. It was at this point that the hearts of every man of the West sunk as the ships of the Corsairs of Umbar arrived. Despite thinking that their defeat and destruction were inevitable, they fought on. Neither side expected Aragorn, alongside the Grey Company and the southern army of Gondor, to emerge from the ships. Yet the impact of this sudden appearance, symbolised by the unfurling of Arwen's banner by Halbarad, was felt by both sides of the conflict. The newly arrived men of the West, with Aragorn at their head, wielding the blade Anduril, drove a wedge through the forces of the Dark Lord, separating those closest to the city from those nearer to the Anduin. None among the servants of Sauron could stand before the might of Anduril that day, as Aragorn swept aside all who stood in his way, cutting deep into the host which threatened his city. Capitalizing upon these unexpected reinforcements, Imrahil and Eomer marshalled their flagging forces time and again through repeated cavalry and infantry charges, cutting off divisions of the Great Horde and slaughtering them en masse. Most of the host of Mordor was slain, with the Orcs now seeing that victory had slipped from their grasp, fleeing and being cut down in the thousands, with many more drowning as they attempted to cross the Anduin to safety. A large force of Easterlings, whose hatred for the men of Gondor outweighed their own instincts for self-preservation, refused to flee the field and fought to the last man, earning the bitter respect of the men of the West. Some of the more disciplined Orcs rallied a rearguard of sorts, and were successful in inflicting heavy casualties upon both the Gondorian and Rohirrim forces, but soon they were overrun too, with Aragorn finishing the last ones off, effectively ending the Orcish resistance and the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. The losses on both sides were considerable, with nearly the entirety of the forces of Mordor utterly destroyed. This was of little consequence to Sauron, however, as he still possessed large numbers of Orcs within the plains of Gorgoroth, alongside his experimental new Uruk-hai units. It was the loss of his chief lieutenant, the Witch King of Angmar, which he rued most, as he remained irreplaceable in the eyes of the Dark Lord. Casualties suffered by the men of the West were also substantial, with Theoden chief among their number. Eomer estimated that less than 4,000 Rohirrim were now capable of battle, with a large number of his forces dead, injured, or having lost their mounts. All in all, however, Aragorn estimated that even with the soldiers he would need in the coming conflict, the garrison of Minas Tirith, with the addition of the southern armies, was now greater than it had been before the siege. Despite his triumphant return to the lands of his forefathers as Isildur's heir, Aragorn, taking counsel from those around him, opted not to immediately take the crown. The possibility for counterclaimants, or those who would actively oppose the return of the king, was too great a chance to take at a stage where the fate of Middle-earth still hung upon a knife's edge. Aragorn sought to act as a healer to his people, immediately curing Faramir and Éowyn, who barely clung to life, before turning his attention to the others who had fought so bravely in the defense of the city, saving many lives and easing the suffering of his people everywhere he went. While these selfless acts immediately won over the likes of Faramir, it was his humility and self-sacrifice, exhausted as he was, that won over the people of Gondor. This also fulfilled the prophecy of Eoreth, the chief healer within the city at the time. The hands of the king are the hands of a healer, and so shall the rightful king be known. He continued to heal people between March 15th and 16th within the walls of the White City, thereafter symbolically leaving the city and refusing to return until the future of Middle-earth had been resolved in favour of the free folk, as preparations were already being made for a final conflict to match that of the sheer immensity of the final days of the War of the Last Alliance. Sauron's attack on the Northern Realms was foreseen by Gandalf many years earlier, leading the then Grey Wizard to aid Thorin in his quest to reclaim the Lonely Mountain. Gandalf had seen through the guise of the Necromancer of Dol Guldur much earlier and predicted that Sauron would make use of the sheer destruction Smaug could unleash in order to destroy Gondor. The dragon's death at the hand of Bard severely dented the Dark Lord's plans, giving the free peoples of Middle-earth a fighting chance in the war to come, while the newly re-established Kingdom of Dale and Kingdom Under the Mountain provided a vital northern bulwark against the forces of Sauron. In TA 3018, Gloin revealed to the Council of Elrond that messengers had arrived at the gates of the Lonely Mountain, sent on behalf of Sauron, seeking information on the Shire and the Hobbits, while also asking for them to turn over Bilbo's ring. Further, they asked for the submission of the kingdoms to Mordor's overlordship, and when these entreaties were refused, dire consequences had been threatened. Messengers likewise approached King Brand of Dale, and when similar requests were refused, Easterlings loyal to the Dark Lord began to gather on the outskirts of Dale. Likewise, in the realm of Thranduil and that of Lothlorien, the numbers of foul creatures encroaching ever further from Dol Guldur into Mirkwood alerted the elves to the fact that they would not be left unscathed in the coming conflict. Thranduil, Celeborn and Galadriel made what preparations they could. However, many of the finest warriors of the elves had at this stage committed to sailing west to Valinor, leaving the respective elvish forces weakened. This northern theatre of the War of the Ring, therefore, pitted the last of the declining races of elves and dwarfs against the ascendant forces of the Dark Lord, with the outcome of pitched battles remaining exceptionally uncertain. War would come first to Dale, however, as on the 17th of March TA 3019, the massive Easterling host crossed the borders of the kingdom, intending to invade and capture the city. The Easterlings were mainly composed of well-equipped and well-drilled warriors from Rhûn, surprising the forces of Dale and the Lonely Mountain with the speed at which they crossed the Redwater River, given their numbers. Kings Brand and Dane II quickly assembled their forces, and it could be estimated that there were 2,500 Dwarves of Erebor and of the Iron Hills, alongside 3,500 men of Dale, compared to that of the 20,000 strong force of Easterlings. This assault coincided with the siege of Minas Tirith in order to prevent any aid coming to Gondor from the north, tying down these forces in a manner Saruman was unable to achieve with the Riders of Rohan. The two kings met the Easterlings in open battle on the same day the Easterlings crossed the river, hoping to prevent the destruction of Dale, putting their faith in the fact that the foundries of Erebor gave them a massive advantage in terms of their arms and armour. 3 days of heavy fighting ensued, wherein the steadfastness of the Dwarves and men of Dale was eventually eroded by the numerical advantage possessed by the men of Rhûn, forcing them to retreat. Seeing that Lake Town would be indefensible, the combined force of men and dwarves attempted to retreat behind the impregnable gates of the Lonely Mountain, with Kings Brand and Dane leading a desperate rearguard action. The two kings managed to buy enough time for their forces to fall back into the mountains, However, Brand was struck down by an Easterling's blade before the gate of the Lonely Mountain. Dain, enraged by the death of his close friend and ally, stood over Brand's corpse and refused to give an inch despite the intense pressure exerted by the far more numerous Easterling force. After a prolonged defense of the King of Dale's body, the Dwarven king under the mountain was also slain, despite the piles of Easterling casualties that mounted around the stalwart king. The forces of the deceased leaders then locked the gates of the mountain and prepared for a prolonged siege. While the men of Dale and Dwarves of Erebor and the Iron Hills remained besieged behind the gates of the Lonely Mountain, their primary hope for victory lay with the men of the west, led by the soon-to-be king of Gondor, Aragorn. Even earlier, Lothlorien had been invaded by a host of orcs coming out of Dol Guldur, first on the 11th of March TA 3019, then again on the 15th, and a final assault was then made upon the Elvish lands on the 22nd of March. Meanwhile, on the 15th of March TA 3019, Thranduil's realm was invaded by a large horde of orcs, beginning what would become known as the Battle Under the Trees. This was done to secure the flank of the assaults on Lothlorien, and prevent the great rulers of the elves converging and forming a unified front against the orcs of Dol Guldur. The Easterlings of Rhûn were to reinforce the assault. However, they had been slowed immeasurably by the stubbornness of the defenders of Erebor. The Galadrim, led by Celeborn and Galadriel, repulsed each assault, relying heavily upon the courage and potency of the renowned elvish swordsman, alongside the power of Galadriel's ring, to counteract the vast numerical advantage of Dol Guldur. While Thranduil also proved his competency in personally leading the elven counterattack, the Elven King, whose forces were more renowned for their deadly archers, emerged victorious after a battle which caused a great ruin of fire throughout the woods. This victory caused Thranduil to declare a new year of the elves shortly after their victory. At this point, Frodo and Sam, alongside their guide Gollum, had made their way to the passes of Cirith Ungol, where the treachery of Gollum was revealed, turning the hobbits against one another, before leading Frodo into the clutches of Shelob, a great spider of immense proportions, and one of the last true descendants of the original Dark Lord Morgoth's ally, Ungoliant. Shelob pricked Frodo with her stinger, causing him to become immobilized and easy prey for the great spider. Sam, however, wielding Sting and the Light of Arendil, fought off the foul beast, saving Frodo's life once more. However, believing his dear friend to be dead, he took the ring and, despite his despair, intended to finish their quest regardless. At this point, a group of orcs and uruks from the garrison of Cirith Ungol came upon Frodo's body and remarked that he was still alive before bringing him to the tower for questioning. Sam then took it upon himself to save the ring-bearer's life once more, and taking advantage of the fact that the garrison had engaged in a mild civil war between the orcs and uruks for the ownership of Frodo's mithril shirt, was able to reach Frodo before he could come to harm. Here he returned the ring, counting himself among only the company of Bilbo, having handed over the One Ring, while also being the only individual to have ever done so willingly. From here, the two hobbits, disguising themselves as best they could, began the perilous journey across the plains of Gorgoroth, which was inhabited by thousands of orcs, in order to complete their quest and cast the ring into the fires of Mount Doom. Meanwhile, following the successful defense of Minas Tirith, Aragorn gathered to him all of the wise men of Gondor, as well as his companions and the most prominent men of Rohan, in order to discuss their final moves in the dying embers of the War of the Ring. This came to be known as the Last Debate, and was conducted outside of the walls of the city, as Aragorn refused to enter until the war had been won and he could be properly proclaimed king. Many men who were well acquainted with tactics and warfare, such as Imrahil and Eomer, put forward their opinions as to the best course of action. Yet it was the counsel of Gandalf which swayed Aragorn, with the wizard remarking, "We have not the ring. Without it we cannot by force defeat his force. But we must at all costs keep his eye from his true peril. We cannot achieve victory by arms, but by arms we can give the ring-bearer his only chance, frail though it be. We must push Sauron to his last throw. We must call out his hidden strength, so that he shall empty his land. We must march out to meet him at once. We must make ourselves the bait, though his jaws should close on us. We must walk open-eyed into that trap, with courage, but small hope for ourselves." Knowing that Frodo and Sam were now within the depths of Mordor, they were left with no other choice but to march out and meet the Dark Lord. By sacrificing their lives, they could buy the Ringbearer enough time to complete his quest and save Middle-earth for good and all. Each and every one of those gathered at this last debate knew that it was likely death awaited them, yet it was the only course of action now left to them. A garrison of a size greater than had originally guarded the city was left, and the Captain of the West took with him 7,000 soldiers of Gondor and Rohan, alongside his Grey Company. The impossibility of victory was not lost on the men of the West, however, with Imrahil laughing aloud before stating, "Surely this is the greatest jest in all the history of Gondor, that we should ride with 7,000, scarce as many as the vanguard of its army in the days of its power, to assail the mountains and the impenetrable gate of the Black Land. So might a child threaten a mail-clad knight with a bow of string and green willow." The host of the Men of the West left Minas Tirith on March 18th and bypassed Minas Morgul, heading straight for the Black Gate. Sauron, falsely believing that Aragorn now possessed the ring and would use its power against him, fell for this ploy and began to send all of his warriors to the Black Gate. Aragorn then left a force of just under 1,000 men at the crossroads in order to guard the road to Minas Tirith should the battle go poorly. Midway through Ithilien, they were then assaulted by Haradrim and Easterlings. The soldiers were quickly detected by the rangers of Ithilien, however, and driven off with little casualties. As the Men of the West approached Dagorlad, a number of the farmers of Lossarnach and some of the fainter of heart among the Rohirrim balked at the prospect of assaulting the Black Gate. Aragorn, displaying his compassion, allowed them to leave, instead sending them to liberate Caer Andros, weakening the army even further, so that they maintained a strength of barely 6,000 men. Yet as the host of the West continued ever onwards, they soon came to see the extraordinary vastness of the Black Gate, and even the most valiant among them began to feel the cold tendrils of fear creep through their veins. Heralds were sent upon Prince Imrahil's suggestion to announce the coming of King Elessar. In response, the Black Gate opened a fraction, allowing for a delegation of the Dark Lord to emerge. At their head was a dark Númenórean of the ancient faction of King's Men who had survived the fall of the kingdom and fallen into the service of Sauron. He was known as the Mouth of Sauron and demanded the surrender of the host, producing Frodo's mithril vest and cloak to the despair of Pippin among Aragorn's retinue. Gandalf then asked for the terms of surrender, which were to be Sauron's recognized dominion over Isengard and Rohan, as well as the vassalage of Gondor, to which the Men of the West refused in the plainest of terms. Enraged by their unwillingness to surrender, the Mouth of Sauron withdrew behind the Black Gate, which now opened, allowing a force of between 60 and 100,000 orcs, trolls and Uruk-hai to emerge. On top of that, thousands of orcs surfaced from the hillsides surrounding the plain of Morannon, with another force of Easterlings appearing from the former Gondorian garrison tower of Carchost, ensuring that the Men of the West now knew the true strength of Mordor. These denizens of the dark proceeded to surround the host of the West, ensuring that retreat was no longer an option. In the early stages of the battle, the Dark Lord's warriors found it difficult to reach the Men of the West due to the large slag pools and pits of waste that surrounded the Black Gate. This bought Aragorn enough time to organize his soldiers. He placed two forces of 3,000 each upon the two slag piles in the center of the plain of Morannon, which were made up of piles of rubble and waste. The contingent upon the right hill was commanded by Imrahil and Éomer in the front line, while consisting of the Knights of Dol Amroth and elements of the Tower Guard, among the regulars of both Rohan and Gondor, while the hill to the left was led by Aragorn alongside Gandalf, the remaining members of the Fellowship, Elladen and Elrohir, sons of Elrond, and the Grey Company, with Arwen's banner flying on its front line. The Dark Lord, with his eye fixed firmly upon the battle, urged his subjects forward. his forces crashed into the host of the West like a tide breaking upon the cliffside. The men of the West held, utilizing their superior discipline and martial prowess, as well as the height advantage afforded by the slag piles, to hold back the orcs, trolls, and evil men. While this valiant defense caused far greater casualties on the part of the Dark Lord, it was not sustainable, and the men of the West were hard pushed to keep up this immense effort. The remaining Nazgul then emerged, threatening to dismantle the disciplined lines of the host of the West, before the Great Eagles entered the battle, led by their Windlord Gwaihir. The Eagles and Nazgul fought for aerial superiority, with Pippin echoing the sentiment of Bilbo during the Battle of the Five Armies by repeating aloud, "The Eagles are coming." As the initial attack of the forces of Sauron failed, armoured trolls, wielding crude maces and cudgels, were sent forth. Their attack managed to effectively break down the lines of the men of the West, allowing orcs to swarm through, making Aragorn's position borderline untenable on both slag piles. The orcs further took example of the Easterlings and engaged in flanking maneuvers, attempting to make the most of their encirclement. It was only by the valour and steadfastness of Aragorn's soldiers that the defence of the slag piles could be maintained, despite overwhelming pressure from all sides. Meanwhile, Sam and Frodo, having disguised themselves as orcs, had at this point reached Mount Doom and looked poised to bring the battle to a premature end. Coming to the slopes of the Crack of Doom, Frodo's strength gave out, however, and he fell, only for Sam to carry him on his back across the last few steps. At this point, Gollum attacked the two hobbits, with Sam managing to fight him off as Frodo stumbled towards the depths of Mount Doom. Sam, having delayed Gollum long enough, made his way to the Crack of Doom, where, to his horror, Frodo had renounced the quest and claimed the ring as his own, placing it upon his finger. Sauron, now realizing that the ring was within the depths of Mount Doom, pulled his gaze from the plains of Morannon towards the Crack of Doom, calling the Nazgul to him. This earned the hard-pressed men of the West a reprieve, as without the will of the Dark Lord driving them onwards, his forces began to falter, allowing the warriors on either slag pile breathing space with which they could reform their lines. A shocked and despairing Sam was caught unaware when Gollum attacked him from behind, knocking him unconscious with a rock, before attacking Frodo. The struggle was brief, as Frodo had been weakened by possessing and resisting the will of the ring for as long as he had, ending with Gollum biting off his finger and taking the one ring from him. Gollum celebrated, reclaiming his precious by dancing maniacally. However, he slipped upon the blood pulsing from Frodo's finger, causing him to fall into the Crack of Doom unwittingly, destroying the one ring. This caused the destruction of Barad-dûr, the Black Gate, and the Towers of the Teeth, while Mount Doom erupted violently, with the two hobbits barely escaping to the mountainside, where they were now surrounded by lava and ash, seemingly doomed, before being rescued by Gandalf, Gwaihir, and his Great Eagles. With the destruction of the ring, Sauron's being and his power were forever lost, and the threat of his dominion ended forever. On the plains of Morannon, the orcs panicked and began to flee, being cut down in droves by the resurgent men of the West, while some of the Easterlings and Haradrim, bearing an undying hatred towards their western counterparts, fought to the last man, being utterly destroyed on that day. Others surrendered and were pardoned by King Elisar. Orc strongholds remained within the plains of Gorgoroth, however, necessitating Aragorn to lead his forces, which were still capable of fighting, immediately into the depths of Mordor to ensure the purging of the area was complete. Aragorn then freed the slaves of Nirn, granting them this extremely fertile area in the far south of the realm of Mordor to be ruled as they wished, following their years of enslavement under the cruel reign of Sauron. News of the demise of the Dark Lord spread quickly, with the Easterlings besieging the Lonely Mountain soon hearing of their overlord's destruction, which sapped them of any degree of morale. The armies of Dale and Erebor, now led by their new kings Bard II and Thorin III Stonehelm, led a sortie consisting of all the forces remaining to them still capable of fighting, and on the 27th of March drove the Easterlings from their lands, ending the siege of the Lonely Mountain. While this was ultimately a victory for Dale and Erebor, the casualties were high, lowering what were already scarce numbers of dwarves, assuring the ascendancy of man. The elves, using their victory at the battle under the trees, and the fact that the Nazgul were gone with the defeat of their master, attacked Dol Guldur, led by Celeborn, Galadriel and Thranduil. We don't know much about the ensuing battle, but what we know for sure is that in one of the last true examples of the magic in this world, Galadriel came to the gates and cast down the walls, foul pits and crevices. Dol Guldur was finally destroyed and the forest was cleansed. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Black Gate and the destruction of the One Ring, Aragorn was returning to Gondor to be duly crowned as King Elessar, having been given the name by Galadriel on May 1st TA 3109. The ceremony was vast in nature, with people from all over Middle-earth coming to witness the events. Faramir met with the soon-to-be king outside the walls of the city, before announcing the return of the king to his people. Here is Aragorn, son of Arathorn, chieftain of the Dunedain of Arnor, captain of the host of the west, bearer of the Star of the North, wielder of the sword reforged, victorious in battle, whose hands bring healing, the Elfstone, Elessar of the line of Valendil, Isildur's son, Elendor's son of Numenor. Shall he be king and enter into the city and dwell there? And all those gathered cried approval aloud in one voice, allowing Aragorn to once more enter the city he had saved not long before, this time not only as a healer, but also as king. Frodo was given the honour of carrying the crown, and Gandalf then placed the wings of pearl and silver, which formed the likeness of a seabird, upon Aragorn's head. Faramir, who was now the steward of Gondor, cried aloud, "Behold the king!" a cry which was taken up once more by the populace of the city in one voice. With this, King Elessar entered the city to the ringing of silver trumpets as the royal banner was unfurled from the highest tower in the city. Several months later, a company of elves led by Elrond came to the city. He handed over to Aragorn the symbol of royalty in Arnor, the scepter of Anúminas, confirming his status as King of Arnor. Shortly afterward, Aragorn and Arwen were married, with the new Queen of Gondor and Arnor renouncing her immortality for the love she bore the greatest of the line of Isildur. Aragorn became the 26th King of Arnor and the 35th King of Gondor, and the first High King of the reunited kingdom. He would found the House of Telconta and rule until the year 120 of the Fourth Age. Soon after this, a great host led by Aragorn went north, and while the king and the rest of the Fellowship stopped in Rivendell, Gandalf and the hobbits continued onwards to the Shire. Dark events transpired in the region in the dying days of the War of the Ring, while the Fellowship was in the south. Using the money earned from selling pipeweed to the wizard Saruman, a relative of Bilbo and Frodo, Lotho Sackville Baggins, initiated a massive land grab, allowing him to take the place of Chief of the Shire. The former White Wizard sent Dunlendings and Goblin men, who the locals started calling ruffians, to assist in this process, providing the necessary support to maintain rule over the hobbits, who were left without protection when the Dunedain went south to support Aragorn. Following the defeat of Sauron, Saruman used the power of his voice, which was one of the last elements of magic he could yet control, to convince Treebeard to allow him to leave the Tower of Isengard. Then, Saruman, under the guise of Sharky, came to the Shire, accompanied by Grima Wormtongue, quickly deposing and imprisoning the former chief and taking direct control over his new dominion. He had begun to turn the once content and peaceful region into an industrialized area, similar to what he had achieved in Isengard. However, Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin arrived just in time to thwart his plans to despoil the region in what became known as the Scouring of the Shire. Before entering the Shire, Gandalf, Frodo and company stayed the night in the Prancing Pony in Bree, and were informed by Barlam and Butterbur that the situation had changed. Strange and harsh men from the south had begun to settle around Bree, much to the discontent of men and hobbits who had previously lived in the area. This culminated in a fight on the streets of Bree, where Saruman's forces, led by Bill Ferny, were driven out by the men of Bree, led by Matt Heathertones. Gandalf then took the hobbits to the edge of the Shire, before leaving to meet with Tom Bombadil, assuring his companions that their training and experiences during the War of the Ring would mean they would meet the challenge with which they were about to be posed. The four hobbits, upon arriving in the Shire, were shocked to see what had become of the home they had fought for so long to protect during the prior events of the War of the Ring. Having grown much in terms of courage and strength throughout their travels, the returning hobbits soon took up a leadership role, rousing all who wished to put an end to Sharky's cruelty. Prior to this mustering, the leadership of Saruman's ruffians challenged Frodo's authority, but when challenged by the blades of the hobbits, fled, allowing Merry to make use of the Horn of Rohan given to him by Theoden to great effect. Moving swiftly, a force of Shire folk was assembled in short order and made what preparations they could to meet the forces of the disgraced former wizard. In total there were 200 Bucklanders, 100 Tooks, and a number of locals supplementing this company, which had to face 150 ruffians. What came next would be known as the Battle of Bywater, and it occurred on November 3rd, TA 3019. As Pippin was still a Knight of Gondor, and wasn't released from his oath by Aragorn, this could also be seen as the first battle in the restoration of Arnor. At this point, the Shire was still a part of the realm of Arnor, allowing the hobbits to engage in combat with the will of the High King of the Dunedain behind them. After being initially rebuked, the leader of the ruffians returned with a larger force. However, they were promptly surrounded, and when he attempted to assault Merry, he was struck down by 4 arrows from the ever-effective archers of the Shire. They displayed the same strength which had allowed them to aid the King of Gondor as far back as the Battle of Fornost. The rest of the ruffians were then arrested and imprisoned. More men were dispatched by Sharky. However, the Hobbit forward scouts gave the members of the Fellowship sufficient time to prepare a defense of Bywater. Merry and Pippin took charge, utilizing everything they had learned during their service in the employ of the King of Rohan and Steward of Gondor. Makeshift roadblocks were prepared using carts and wagons, and when the ruffians arrived, they entered the center of the built-up area only to find they had been entrapped. The advantages of their greater stature and strength compared to an individual hobbit were eliminated in this way. Attempting a breakout, many were struck down by the deadly volleys of arrows loosed by the hobbits, and those who successfully broke through their entrapment were promptly surrounded and cut down. Sam, Merry and Pippin took an active role in the combat, displaying their martial prowess and inspiring their fellow Shirefolk to hold the line, even though they were not comparable in terms of strength. Frodo meanwhile did not fight, but instead ensured that every ruffian who threw down their arms and surrendered was not slaughtered, but instead imprisoned and treated fairly. The battle was a resounding victory for the Shirefolk, as only 19 hobbits were killed with 30 wounded, compared to the 70 ruffians who were killed and 12 captured, while the remainder of Sharky's men fled the Shire. The following day, Frodo and the other hobbits led their force to Hobbiton to confront Sharky, discovering it was in fact Saruman. The wizard was now powerless, and Frodo exiled him, granting him his life if he was to leave the Shire and never return. Saruman, having been forever tainted by his former master Sauron, responded with characteristic cruelty, decrying the weakness of the hobbits before viciously kicking Grima Wormtongue. This was too much for the former Man of Rohan, whose patience broke, and he lunged for the former despot of the Shire, slitting his throat. Before Frodo could stop them, the archers of the Shire reacted, piercing Grima with multiple arrows and ending his life immediately. This was the last military engagement of the War of the Ring. The War of the Ring had far-ranging ramifications for every nation in Middle-earth, none more so than that of Gondor. Aragorn went on to rebuild the Kingdom of Arnor after so many years of decay, fostering close relations with the other realms of men, dwarves and elves, among them Dale and Erebor, who continued to prosper in the Fourth Age. He also successfully campaigned alongside his chief commanders Imrahil and Eomer against the Easterlings and Haradrim, forever ending the threat posed by them. The three men led campaigns beyond the Sea of Rhûn, enforcing peace with the Easterlings who dwelt there. Campaigns to the south were also conducted, with the dual might of Gondor and Rohan forcing the men of Harad to give up their possessions in southern Gondor. Likewise, an assault was made on the city of Umbar, which Aragorn had last entered while serving under Denethor's father under the guise of Thorongil. The Corsairs of Umbar were utterly routed, and the port city, which had been founded by the Númenóreans so many centuries prior, was returned to its holdings, with the remaining black Númenóreans who resided there seemingly killed also, bringing an end to their destructive legacy since the fall of Númenor. The Orcs had also been reduced to insignificant mountain bands following the destruction of the Dark Lord, and the United Kingdom, not that one, reached its greatest territorial extent since Elendil first arrived in the west, ensuring there were no longer any true threats to the High Kingship. Aragorn maintained Minas Tirith as his capital, leading to a quick repopulation of the region, reconstructed Annúminas to serve as his northern capital, and rebuilt Fornos Dorain from the ruins of the desolation of the Witch King, constructing a great city in which many men came to reside. The kingdom of Arnor once more prospered, as the corruption wrought by the Great War in the north was finally cleansed from the region, and it would once more regain the strength it had once possessed at its height. Minas Morgul was razed to the ground, as its corruption would take many years to be fully cleansed from the former joint fortresses of Gondor, with a new holding being built in the Emen Arnen for Faramir and Éowyn to dwell within. Osgiliath was once more rebuilt, also regaining the splendour which had initially made it the first capital of the kingdom, becoming more and more populous as the reign of Elisar continued. Aragorn named Faramir Prince of Ithilien, marrying Éowyn, and the Shire was given independent status from the newly re-established realm of Arnor under the sceptre of Annúminas. The king even added the Westmarch to its territory, decreeing that no man was ever to enter into the Shire again, himself included. Even after Aragorn's death, following 120 years of wise rule and the accession of his son, Eldarion, the descendants of this line would continue to rule wisely and well, maintaining the golden age started by their patriarch following on from the flames of war. Meanwhile, Arwen would die just a year after her husband of a broken heart and was buried at Carin Amroth in Lorien. In Rohan, Éomer assumed the throne, marrying his dear friend Imrahil's daughter, Lothiriel, who he had fallen in love with during his stay in Gondor. He would prove a gallant ally to the Gondorians in the campaigns that followed, ensuring the Oath of Yorl would continue in perpetuity. Isengard was granted to the Ents, who filled in Saruman's pits and reforested the area, renaming it the Treegarth of Orthanc. While in the Glittering Caves, which Gimli had been forced to take refuge in during the Battle of Helm's Deep, permission was given by Éomer for him to set up a Dwarven colony there, which prospered for many years due to the mineral wealth of the caves. The Balrog, being now defeated, also allowed the Longbeard Dwarfs under Durin VII to retake Khazad Dûm after so many years exiled from their holds. Legolas would go on to found a colony in Ithilien, while his father Thranduil, alongside Celeborn and Galadriel, purged Dol Guldur of corruption and created a land for the Beornings to reside. However, the destruction of the One Ring ensured the decline of the elves, as the Three Rings began to fade in power, causing the kingdoms which had been preserved by them to fade also. This caused a mass exodus of elves across the sea to Valinor, with all three of the ring-bearers departing. Lorien was eventually abandoned, with the elves of Lothlorien who did not depart moving to the southern part of Mirkwood, founding the realm of East Lorien. The majority of the elves of Rivendell also departed, leaving only Elrond's sons, Celeborn, and a small population of elves to inhabit the region. Eventually, Celeborn, whose heart yearned for Galadriel, took passage to the Undying Lands with his company, and it is said that with him went the last living memory of the elder days in Middle-earth. Frodo never truly recovered from his wounds, and upon finishing his version of The Lord of the Rings in the Red Book of Westmarch in the year of the Third Age 3021, joined Bilbo and Gandalf, who by now had achieved all that was required of him in Middle-earth, as well as Elrond and Galadriel aboard an elven ship. Frodo and Bilbo were allowed passage to the Undying Lands as they were ring-bearers, in the hopes of healing the damage to their spirit that bearing the ring had caused. Sam married Rosie Cotton, having 13 children with her, and was elected Mayor of the Shire for 7 consecutive 7-year terms, before in the year 61 of the Fourth Age, leaving to take a ship to the Undying Lands as a former ring-bearer to join Frodo in Pelenor. Meanwhile, Merry became the Master of Buckland in the year 11 of the Fourth Age, living at Brandy Hall and also Crickhollow, and in the year 13 of the Fourth Age, Pippin became the 32nd Thane of the Shire, a position he maintained for 40 years, before renouncing it in the year 63 of the Fourth Age, when he revisited Rohan and Gondor with Merry. Merry was 102 years old at this stage, and died in Gondor not long after arriving, being laid to rest in Gondor. Pippin died not long after, and was laid to rest with Merry in Gondor. After the great King Elisar died in the year 120 of the Fourth Age, Merry and Pippin were entombed next to him. After Aragorn's death, Legolas and Gimli left their respective colonies in the hands of their people. The pair, that had grown incomprehensibly close despite initial frictions between them, then went west, where Legolas built one last ship at the Havens to take them across the sea towards Pelenor. In doing so, Gimli became the first and only ever dwarf to make his way to the Undying Lands. Neither of them was ever seen again in Middle-earth, and lived in Pelenor with their old friends to the very dying days of the world. This video brings us to the end of the War of the Ring. We sincerely hope you enjoyed this series on the world of Middle-earth. We're now working on a series that will cover the first age of Tolkien's world. We're also planning to cover the battles of many other fantasy, sci-fi and space opera universes, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Please consider liking and sharing as it helps immensely, and don't forget to comment. We'll try to read and respond to every comment, as we want to know what you think about this video and which videos you hope to see in the future. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.